The man grabbed her wrist before she could take another step. Not roughly, not with the frantic desperation of someone who had lost control. He did it the way a man closes a door he's been waiting to close for a very long time. With complete, terrifying certainty. Sienna Vale had just kissed him, and she had no idea who he was. The hallway was dim, lit only by the amber glow bleeding in from the grand ballroom at the other end of the Delorenzo estate. The music, the laughter, the clinking of crystal glasses, all of it felt impossibly far away now. Because the man standing in front of her was not Luca. He had Luca's jaw, Luca's height, Luca's dark hair swept back the same way, but his eyes, God, his eyes were something else entirely. Where Luca's gaze was warm and open like a window facing the afternoon sun, this man's eyes were like the bottom of a lake you couldn't see the end of. Still, deep, and watching her like she was the most interesting problem he'd encountered in years. Sienna's voice came out smaller than she intended. She cleared her throat. I thought you were... I know who you thought I was. His voice was low, unhurried. A voice that had never once needed to raise itself to get what it wanted. His grip on her wrist didn't tighten. He didn't need to. The question is, what do you plan to do about it? Sienna pulled her arm back. He let her go. Immediately, easily, as if he'd only been holding her wrist to make a point, not to trap her. She took 2 steps back. Her heel caught the edge of the ornate rug and she nearly stumbled, but she caught herself against the wall, fingers pressing into the cool plaster. This was a mistake, she said. The words felt embarrassingly inadequate. I'm sorry. I genuinely thought you were Luca. The man tilted his head slightly, the way you might when someone says something almost amusing. I know. Then, my name is Damen. The name hit her like a drop in temperature. She'd heard it once before, spoken in hushed tones by Luca's mother over dinner 3 weeks ago. The only dinner Sienna had managed to have with any Delorenzo before tonight. Damen doesn't come to family events anymore, Elena Delorenzo had said, and something in her expression had made Sienna decide not to ask why. Now she understood why the name had carried that weight. Because Damen Delorenzo was looking at her like she had just wandered into a room where the rules of ordinary life no longer applied. I should go find Luca, Sienna said. You should, Damen agreed. Neither of them moved. If you ever find yourself watching someone else's life from the outside, if you ever try to figure out where things went wrong, this would be the moment, not the kiss itself. The 5 seconds afterwards, standing in a hallway that smelled of old wood and expensive candles, when Sienna Vale should have walked away and didn't. She didn't know why. She was a practical woman. She had built her whole life on being practical. But something in the way Damen Delorenzo stood there, perfectly still, perfectly composed, watching her with those deep, unreadable eyes, made her feel like leaving would mean conceding something she hadn't agreed to give up. How long have you been standing in this hallway? She asked. He almost smiled. Almost. Long enough. If you're new here, welcome. And if you've been around for a while, you already know that the stories we tell here don't let go of you easily. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss what happens next, and drop a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from. We read every single one. Now, let's go back to the beginning, because to understand how Sienna Vale ended up kissing the wrong man in a dark hallway at a Mafia family's estate, you have to understand exactly who Sienna Vale was before that night changed everything. Well, she was 34 years old, and she had been rebuilding for 3 years. That was the clearest way she knew how to describe her life. Not growing, not starting over, but rebuilding. The way you rebuild after a flood. Not because you want to, because you don't have any other option. Her daughter's name was Maya. She was 6 years old, wore her hair in 2 uneven pigtails that Sienna could never get perfectly symmetrical no matter how many times she tried, and was the single most important reason Sienna got out of bed every morning. Maya had her mother's dark eyes and her father's stubborn chin, and she had inherited from both of them an unshakable certainty that she was right about most things. Maya's father was not in the picture. That was the sanitized version. The full version involved a man named Derek Chen who had been charming and brilliant and completely incapable of being honest about anything that mattered. By the time Sienna had figured out the scope of his dishonesty, the financial decisions he'd made without telling her, the debts he'd accumulated in their shared name, The affair that had been happening since before Maya was even born. Their marriage had already collapsed from the inside like a building where someone had quietly been removing the load-bearing walls. The divorce had taken 11 months and cost Sienna nearly everything she'd saved. She'd moved to Chicago with Maya in her arms and $8,000 left in her account and a design portfolio she'd spent 6 years building. She found a small firm willing to take a chance on her. She worked nights after Maya went to sleep, took every client she could handle, slowly rebuilt her reputation in a new city where nobody owed her anything and nobody was going to give her anything for free. 3 years later, she had a client list that made people notice. A small apartment in Lincoln Park that she'd furnished herself. Carefully, thoughtfully, every piece chosen because it meant something. A daughter who was thriving, a life that was quiet and steady and hers. And then she met Luca Delorenzo. He'd come into her life the way good things sometimes do. Sideways, when she wasn't looking for anything. She'd been doing a consult for a boutique hotel in the River North neighborhood, arguing cheerfully with the building's property manager about ceiling heights, when she'd nearly walked directly into a man coming around a corner with 2 cups of coffee. They'd managed not to collide, mostly through the kind of awkward mutual stumbling that ends with both people laughing at themselves. He'd handed her one of the coffees without hesitation. She'd taken it without thinking. They'd stood in the lobby for 45 minutes talking about architecture, Chicago winters, and the strange loneliness of eating good food alone in a city full of people. Luca Delorenzo was 36. He had an easy laugh and a habit of listening to people like they were saying something worth hearing. He worked in real estate development, the legitimate side of the Delorenzo family business. He'd been careful to explain, with an openness she'd appreciated. His family had complicated history. He wasn't going to pretend otherwise. But he'd spent a decade building his own path inside that complication, and he was proud of the work. She'd appreciated the honesty. After Derek, honesty felt like a glass of cold water after years of thirst. They'd been together for 6 months when he invited her to the estate. The Delorenzo estate sat on the north shore of Lake Michigan, 45 minutes outside Chicago proper, behind a set of iron gates that Sienna would have found imposing under any circumstances. The night of the party, arriving with Luca in the passenger seat of his car, she'd felt the gates close behind them and had told herself the slight tightening in her chest was nothing more than first impression nerves. She was meeting his family, that was all. She'd met people's families before. But the Delorenzo estate was not a family home in the ordinary sense. It was a statement. 3 stories of stone and dark timber set back from the lake's edge, every window lit from within, the grounds immaculately maintained in a way that suggested money and control in equal measure. Cars lined the private drive, expensive ones, the kind whose value Sienna could estimate from a glance after years of dealing with clients who considered their possessions a form of communication. "Nervous?" Luca had asked as they'd walked toward the entrance. "Should I be?" He'd laughed, that warm, easy laugh that she'd come to rely on. "My mother is going to love you. My Uncle Roberto will tell you 3 stories about Italy that all contradict each other, and my Aunt Maria will try to feed you until you physically cannot move." "And the rest of your family?" A slight pause. Brief enough that she might have imagined it. "The rest of my family will be on their best behavior." She'd taken that for the answer it was, and decided not to push. Inside, the party was everything the exterior promised. Loud and warm and full of people who knew each other in that particular way that suggested history too long and complicated to explain to an outsider. Sienna had navigated it with the practiced ease of a woman who had spent years putting clients at ease in unfamiliar spaces, asking the right questions, laughing at the right moments, listening more than she spoke. Elena Delorenzo, Luca's mother, had greeted her with both hands cupping Sienna's face and a look of such genuine warmth that Sienna's throat had tightened unexpectedly. "He talks about you," Elena had said simply. "He talks about you like he means it." Uncle Roberto had told her 4 stories about Italy, not 3, and 2 of them definitely contradicted each other, and Sienna had loved him immediately. Aunt Maria had pressed food on her with the focused determination of someone completing a mission. For 2 hours, Sienna had felt something she hadn't expected to feel in this house, at ease. And then Luca had been pulled into a conversation with his cousin about something that required maps and lowered voices, and he'd squeezed Sienna's hand and said 2 minutes, and she'd said, "Take your time," and she'd gone looking for the bathroom. She'd taken a wrong turn. What? The Delorenzo estate was the kind of house where a wrong turn was a real navigational problem. The West Wing hallway alone stretched long enough that the ballroom noise faded to a soft murmur within 30 seconds of entering it. The light was different here, older, the wall sconces casting amber circles on dark wood paneling, the ceiling high enough to make footsteps echo. Sienna had pulled out her phone to text Luca, noticed she had no signal in this part of the house, and turned to retrace her steps. That was when she saw him. A figure standing at the far end of the hallway, half in shadow, turned slightly away. The build was right. The posture was right. The dark dinner jacket, the particular way he held himself, it was so familiar that her whole body simply responded before her brain could catch up. She smiled. She walked toward him. She reached out and touched his shoulder, and he turned and she said, "There you are," in a voice that was low and warm and meant only for him, and she kissed him. It lasted perhaps 2 seconds. 2 seconds in which everything she thought she knew arranged itself into an entirely new configuration, because even in those 2 seconds, before she pulled back, before she opened her eyes and saw what she should have noticed immediately, something was different. The stillness was different. The way he received the kiss rather than returning it, with that quiet, utter composure that was nothing at all like Luca's warmth. She stepped back. She looked up, and she understood. "You're Damen," she said. Not a question. Yes. Luca's twin brother. He said it without inflection. Yes. The silence between them had texture. Sienna was aware of her own heartbeat in a way she hadn't been since the worst moments of her marriage, when she'd learned to feel herself very clearly in order to stay calm. "I'm so sorry," she said. She meant it. The mortification was real and complete. "I genuinely didn't. I couldn't see clearly from the other end of the hall, and your build is—" "I know," Damen said, for the second time that evening. Something about the repetition bothered her, the certainty of it, as if he understood things she hadn't said. "You don't need to look at me like that," she said. "Like what?" "Like you're trying to figure out what I am." He was quiet for a moment. Not uncomfortable quiet, comfortable quiet. The kind that belongs to people who have never felt the need to fill silence just to make others feel better. "I'm not trying to figure out what you are," he said finally. "I'm fairly certain I already know." The words landed somewhere she hadn't expected. Not threatening, not arrogant, just stated, like a fact he'd had for a while and was only just choosing to share. "And what am I?" she asked. "Unexpected," Damen said. Then he looked past her toward the far end of the hallway, toward the light, and the music, and the party where the rest of his family was. And something passed across his face. Not pain exactly, more like the memory of it. "You should find Luca," he said. "He'll be looking for you." "Right." She straightened, smoothed the front of her dress, reminded herself that she was a 34-year-old adult professional who had survived worse embarrassments than this. "Right. And this doesn't need to be a thing?" He almost smiled again, that same almost. "It's not a thing." She nodded, walked back toward the light. She made it about 12 steps before she heard him say, quietly, not raised, not called after her, just spoken into the hallway as if she might or might not hear it. Yet, she didn't turn around, but she heard it. The rest of the evening passed the way evenings do when you're carrying something you can't put down, in a kind of determined normalcy that takes more effort than it should. Sienna found Luca. He apologized for disappearing. She said it was fine, she'd wandered and found the hallway and come back. All true. All incomplete. She ate dinner next to him and laughed at his uncle's stories and answered Elena's questions about her work with genuine enthusiasm, because the work was something she could talk about honestly and freely. She designed spaces that made people feel safe. That was the heart of it. She figured out what people needed, not what they asked for, but what they needed, and she built it for them. "She sees things," Luca told his mother proudly, and Sienna had squeezed his hand under the table, grateful. Through dinner, she did not look toward the table in the far corner of the room where Damen Delorenzo sat with 2 men she didn't recognize, drinking slowly and speaking rarely. She did not look. She was certain of it. She was only slightly less certain that she could feel his attention like a change in air pressure. At the end of the night, driving back toward the city with Luca's hand warm on hers across the center console, she told herself that what had happened in that hallway was exactly what it appeared to be. A mistake, brief and meaningless, caused by bad lighting and a family resemblance she hadn't been warned about. She told herself this with the focused conviction of a woman who had spent 3 years being right about the things that mattered. And she almost believed it. Almost. Except for one thing she couldn't quite get rid of, no matter how many reasonable explanations she arranged around it. The way Damen Delorenzo had said yet. Not threatening, not promising, just true. The way someone states something they already know the ending of, while you're still figuring out the beginning. Yet. Maya was asleep when she got home, curled on her side in the small room Sienna had painted yellow, because her daughter had said yellow felt like sunshine coming from inside. The babysitter, Mrs. Patterson from downstairs, reported a good evening, 2 pieces of leftover pizza, 1 negotiated extension of bedtime, and a drawing Maya had made and left on the kitchen table for her mother. Sienna unfolded it. A house with a yellow door, 2 figures in front of it, 1 tall, 1 small. The small one labeled me. The tall one labeled Moma, because Maya had strong opinions about spelling and saw no reason to revise them. Sienna stood in her kitchen in her good dress at 11:30 at night and looked at the drawing and felt the weight of her life settle around her. The good weight, the weight that meant something was real and worth protecting. She had a daughter who drew her pictures. She had work that she was proud of. She had Luca, who listened and laughed and meant what he said. Whatever had happened in that hallway was finished. A mistake with no consequences, if she chose to make it one. She chose to make it one. She folded Maya's drawing carefully and put it on the refrigerator with a magnet shaped like a Chicago skyline. She went to bed. She lay in the dark for a long time before she slept, and if the last thing that moved through her mind before she finally went under was the sound of a voice saying yet, well, that was nobody's business but her own. 3 weeks passed. In those 3 weeks, Sienna completed 2 projects, a ground floor redesign for a financial services company in the Loop, whose partners had originally wanted everything in shades of gunmetal gray, a aesthetic choice she diplomatically but firmly redirected towards something that wouldn't make their employees feel like they worked inside a storm cloud, and won a bid for a residential project in Hyde Park that would be the largest single commission of her career. She celebrated alone with Maya at their kitchen table, with takeout noodles and sparkling juice and champagne flutes because occasions deserved appropriate vessels even when you were 6 years old. Maya had not entirely understood what the bid meant, but had grasped that it was important and had therefore treated it with the full gravity of her considerable personality, offering a toast that went, "To Mommy's thing, may it be very good." It was the best toast Sienna had ever received. She saw Luca 3 times in those 3 weeks. Their relationship had the comfortable rhythm of 2 people who had both been through enough to know that what they had was good and worth treating carefully. No grand gestures, no excessive declarations, just the steady accumulation of small good things. Dinners where they talked about their days, a Sunday at the museum where Maya had informed Luca at length about her opinion of the dinosaur skeletons, an evening on her couch watching a movie he'd never seen, and she'd seen too many times, and could therefore quote under her breath at appropriate moments. She did not think about Damen Delorenzo. She was definitive about this. She noted that she was not thinking about him the way you note the absence of a sound you've been hearing, with a slight, involuntary awareness that the silence is there. And then, on a Wednesday afternoon in the middle of October, she walked out of a client meeting on Michigan Avenue and found him standing on the sidewalk outside. Not waiting for her, not looking at her, just there. In a dark coat, speaking quietly into a phone, turned half away from the foot traffic moving around him with the particular stillness of a person who occupies space rather than navigates it. He looked up as she came through the door. The recognition was mutual and instantaneous, and his expression, for half a second before it settled back into composure, was something she hadn't expected. He looked unsurprised, the way you look unsurprised at something you've been expecting. "Ms. Vale," he said. "Mr. Delorenzo." She matched his register automatically, formal, neutral. "I didn't know you had business in this building." "I have business in most buildings," he said. Not arrogant, just factual. "Right." She adjusted her portfolio bag on her shoulder. Luca didn't mention, Luca doesn't know I'm here, Damen said. A brief pause. I'm not required to share my calendar with my brother. Of course not. She could hear herself being clipped and professional and hated it slightly, because it was exactly the register she adopted when she was uncertain, and she didn't want him to know she was uncertain. Well, I'll leave you to, how's the Hyde Park Commission? She stopped, turned back slowly. Damon was watching her with that same quality of complete attention she remembered from the hallway, as if she were a problem he was working through and finding interesting. How do you know about the Hyde Park Commission? She asked. Her voice came out very even. She was proud of that. I make it a point to know things, he said. That's a non-answer. It's a precise answer, he said, just not a satisfying one. She looked at him for a moment, really looked, the way she looked at a space before she designed it, trying to find its real structure beneath its apparent structure. And she thought, this man is used to being the most powerful person in any room he enters, and he is completely unapologetic about it, and somehow that is less frightening than it should be, and that itself is the frightening part. I have to go pick up my daughter, she said. Of course. She walked away. She didn't hear him say anything this time. She wasn't sure if that made it better or worse. The second time she saw him was not an accident, or at least she suspected it wasn't. She was at the Hyde Park property, doing her first walkthrough of the space, taking measurements and photographs and filling her notebook with the scrawled observations that formed the first rough architecture of every project she'd ever done. The building was a 1920s gray stone that had been converted and reconverted across a century of changing hands, and it had the particular quality of spaces that have housed many different lives, a kind of accumulated weight, a layering of intention. She loved it. She was already, in the way she always began, falling a little bit in love with the problem of it. She was on the second floor, standing at a window and looking out at the courtyard below, when she heard footsteps on the stairs. They were unhurried footsteps. Certain ones. She had begun to associate those qualities with only one person. Damen came up through the stairwell and stopped at the threshold of the room. He looked around with the quick, evaluating scan of a man who assessed spaces professionally, and something in his expression shifted slightly, a recognition, perhaps, of what she was doing. This property belongs to a business associate of mine, he said. He asked me to check on the progress. Dominic Ferraro is your business associate? Sienna asked. The owner of the property, a quiet, impeccably mannered man in his 60s, who had inherited the building from his family and wanted to restore rather than renovate. He didn't mention that. He wouldn't, Damen said, in a tone that did not invite follow-up. She went back to her notebook, made herself write the measurement she'd been about to record. You chose well, Damen said. She looked up. I was looking at the room, specifically at the window she'd been standing at, the original lead glass panes, the way the October light came through the distortions in the glass and made patterns on the worn floorboards. The glass, he said. You'll keep it. It wasn't a question. Most designers would replace it, she said. It's technically imperfect, but the way it breaks the light makes the room feel like it has history. He nodded once. Yes. She looked at him, really looked, again. You've renovated properties, she said. Several. Then you know what I'm doing. I know what you're doing, he agreed, and I know you're good at it. There was nothing overtly wrong with the words. They were, taken in isolation, a compliment about her professional competence. But the way he said them, the quiet directness of them, landed somewhere beyond professional. Mr. Delorenzo, Damen. I need to be clear about something. She closed her notebook, faced him directly, because she had learned over the years that directness was always cheaper than evasion. I'm with Luca. Whatever happened in that hallway was a mistake. I'd prefer it if we could simply move past it and have a normal professional relationship, if that's necessary, given our connections. He regarded her for a long moment. That's very reasonable, he said. Good. I'm also curious what made you think I was suggesting otherwise. The question was infuriatingly fair. He hadn't suggested otherwise. Not explicitly. He had simply appeared, twice, in spaces where she was, and looked at her with that attention that made her feel like something was being quietly and irrevocably noted. Nothing, she said stiffly. You're right. I was being practical, he said. You're a practical woman. I noticed that about you at the party. You watch me at the party. I watch everyone at those events, he said. Most people perform for the room. You were talking to my mother like she was a person. She is a person. Not everyone at those dinners treats her that way. There was something under the words she couldn't quite see the shape of, something that suggested longer and more complicated history than she had access to. She recognized the quality of it because she'd carried that kind of history herself, the weight of things that couldn't be explained quickly. Your mother was kind to me, Sienna said, slightly differently than she'd intended. She seemed, I don't know, relieved. She's been wanting Luca to settle down, Damen said. And then, almost to himself more quietly, she's been wanting a lot of things to be different. The room held them for a moment, still and October lit. I should finish the walkthrough, Sienna said. Of course. He turned toward the stairs. Paused. The east-facing bedroom on the third floor. The plaster has water damage on the east wall. You'll want to investigate the exterior drainage before you commit to a restoration timeline. She stared at him. How do you know that? I inspected the building 6 months ago, he said, for Ferraro, before he commissioned you. He went back down the stairs. She stood in the October light coming through imperfect glass and looked at the space he'd left and had the clear, sober realization that she was going to need to be considerably more careful than she had been. Not about Damen Delorenzo, about herself. She went to the east-facing bedroom on the third floor. The water damage was exactly where he'd said it was. She told Luca about the second encounter over dinner that Friday. Not all of it. Not the water damage, not the way the conversation had moved, not the particular feeling of being seen clearly by someone she didn't know well enough to warrant it. But the fact of it, she'd run into Damen at the Hyde Park property. He had a connection to the building's owner. They'd spoken briefly. Luca's face did something small and complicated. He stopped, started again. Damen tends to appear in places unexpectedly. He always has. Is that a concern? Luca was quiet for a moment, turning his wine glass slowly. Damen and I, another pause. We grew up very differently. Same house, same parents, but differently. He was closer to my father. When certain parts of the business became what they became, he stopped again. Looked up at her with something that was part honesty and part exhaustion. He made choices I didn't make. We've been finding our way around that for a long time. She reached across the table and put her hand on his. You don't have to explain everything right now, she said. He turned his hand over and held hers. His grip was warm and familiar. I just want you to know that that whatever he says or does, Luca. She met his eyes. I trust you. He smiled. The warm, open smile that she had come to rely on. I don't deserve you, he said. You definitely deserve me, she said. I'm extremely reasonable. He laughed. She laughed with him. And the thing she hadn't told him sat between them, small and quiet, like a splinter so fine you couldn't see it but could always feel the presence of. She resolved, with all the practical determination she had, to remove it before it could work its way in any deeper. She made this resolution sincerely. She meant it completely. But she had been wrong about things she meant completely before. October became November. The Hyde Park project consumed her in the best possible way. The slow, satisfying labor of a problem that was genuinely hard, that asked something real of her. She spent evenings after Maya was asleep doing detailed sketches of the original moldings, researching period-accurate restoration techniques, tracking down a supplier who still worked with the same type of lime plaster used in 1920s Chicago construction. She was good at her work. She had always been good at her work. And there was a particular comfort in that, in the certainty that whatever else she couldn't control, here was a domain where effort produced result, where the hours she put in were reflected in something tangible and real. 2 weeks into November, Sienna got a call from a man named Gordon Walsh. Walsh was the CEO of Walsh Property Group, one of the largest commercial real estate developers in the Midwest. He had heard about her work from multiple sources and wanted to discuss a project, a full gut renovation of a historic department store building he'd acquired in the West Loop, converting it into a mixed-use development. It was, by any measure, the kind of commission that could define a career, the kind that led to other things of the same scale. She agreed to meet. The first meeting went well. Walsh was smooth, well-prepared, knowledgeable about what he wanted. He had a clear vision for the space and the resources to realize it, and Sienna felt the familiar excitement of a problem that was big enough to be genuinely engaging. The second meeting was different. Walsh came to the table with a contract. It was 40 pages long. She took it home and read it that night after Maya fell asleep, with the systematic focus she brought to any document with financial implications. And by page 18, she had identified the section that changed everything. The contract included a clause that gave Walsh Property Group first right of refusal on all Sienna's design work for a period of 5 years. Any commission she accepted during that period would need Walsh's approval. Any client relationship would need to be disclosed. The exclusivity was not stated plainly. It was threaded through legal language designed to obscure its meaning, but it was there. She would, in effect, become a captive designer. Not an employee, technically, not with employment protections, but tied to Walsh's orbit, dependent on his approval, with her independence dismantled piece by piece in language that made it sound like opportunity. She sat with the contract for a long time, thought about the commission, thought about what it would mean for her business, her reputation, the pace at which she'd been growing. Then she thought about what it would mean to sign it. She called Walsh the next morning and said, politely, that she had questions about the terms and would like to discuss them before proceeding. Walsh's warmth on the phone cooled perceptibly. "The terms are standard," he said, "for a commission of this scale." "With respect," Sienna said, "the exclusivity provisions aren't standard for independent design contracts. They're more consistent with employment agreements, and that's not the relationship I'm proposing." The temperature dropped further. "I think you might be misreading the document." "I read carefully," she said. "I'd be happy to discuss specific language with both our attorneys present." Walsh paused. "Of course," he said finally. "Let me get back to you." He did not get back to her. What he did instead, over the following 10 days, was make 3 separate calls to clients in her existing network. She learned this from each of them independently. From a woman named Patricia Nguyen, who ran an architecture firm and had referred 3 clients to Sienna in the past year. From a boutique hotel owner named James Carr, whose lobby Sienna had redesigned the previous spring. From a residential developer named Scott Burnham, who had been about to hire her for a new project. Walsh, in each case, had expressed concerns about Sienna's reliability and her professional judgment. He had been careful. Nothing outright defamatory. Nothing that could be clearly disproven. Just doubts, planted carefully in the minds of people who trusted him because of his scale and his reach. Patricia Nguyen called Sienna to tell her directly, because Patricia Nguyen was a person of integrity who believed people deserved to know when someone was working against them. Scott Burnham sent her an apologetic email saying he'd decided to go in a different direction. James Carr did not call. Sienna sat with this information for 24 hours. Then she had a conversation with her attorney, an even-keeled woman named Carol Prentice, who had handled her divorce and who Sienna trusted completely. Carol confirmed what Sienna already knew. The damage Walsh had done was real, but difficult to address legally without significant resources she didn't currently have, and any legal action would take time during which Walsh could continue to undermine her. She hung up from Carol and sat in her office and looked at the wall where she pinned the drawings she was working on, the Hyde Park restoration plans, the sketches, the notes to herself in her own handwriting about what each space should feel like when it was finished. She was not going to be pushed out of her own livelihood by a man who thought her independence was a problem to be solved. But she also knew, with the clear pragmatism of someone who had been fighting battles by herself for 3 years, that she needed to figure out her next move carefully. She was still sitting with that problem 2 days later when Dominic Ferraro called. "I understand you've been having some difficulties," Ferraro said, in his quiet, precise way. She stiffened. "Where did you hear that?" "I hear things," he said. "Ms. Vale, I want to assure you that my confidence in your work is entirely unaffected, and I want to let you know that I've spoken to several colleagues about your professional reputation, preemptively. Mr. Ferraro, I appreciate that, but I also want to be transparent with you about something," he continued. "I became aware of the Walsh situation through Damen Delorenzo. He called me and suggested I might want to be proactive." The silence that followed was significant. "Damen called you," Sienna said slowly. "Yes." "About my situation?" "Yes." She was very quiet for a moment, processing the information with the deliberate calm she'd learned to use in moments that wanted to destabilize her. Why would he do that? You'd have to ask him, Ferraro said. But for what it's worth, Ms. Vale, I've known Damen Delorenzo for a long time. He doesn't make calls like that for people he doesn't consider worth making calls for. After she hung up, Sienna sat in her office for a long time. She wasn't angry. She should have been, probably. Her independence, her professional autonomy, the careful separation she'd tried to maintain. He'd stepped into her situation without being asked. But she kept thinking about the 10 days of Walsh's quiet campaign against her reputation, and the fact that she'd been solving it alone, and the fact that somewhere in the city, without a word to her, Damen Delorenzo had picked up a phone on her behalf. She thought about the water damage on the east wall, the way he'd looked at the lead glass windows. Makes the room feel like it has history. She thought about the way Luca's face had done that small, complicated thing when she'd mentioned the second encounter. She thought, I am in trouble. Not the Walsh kind of trouble, that she could manage. The other kind. The kind where you realize the thing you've been not thinking about has been thinking about you. She drove to pick up Maya from school, watched her daughter run across the playground with her uneven pigtails and her absolute certainty about everything, and felt the familiar fierce love of it. This thing she had built, this life, this small person who trusted her completely. She was not going to be careless with any of it. She was going to be very, very careful. She had made that decision before. She made it again now. And drove home in the early November dark, with the radio playing something she didn't hear, and the city moving around her in its ordinary way, and the name Damen Delorenzo sitting in her chest like something she hadn't asked to carry and couldn't put down. The call from Dominic Ferraro changed something in the architecture of Sienna's days. Not dramatically, not in a way she could point to and say, there, that is where it shifted. It was more like the way a room changes when you move one piece of furniture. The proportions stay the same. The light comes in the same windows, but your body has to relearn where everything is. She kept working. She kept picking up Maya from school and making dinner and returning emails and measuring rooms and arguing pleasantly with contractors about load-bearing walls. She kept seeing Luca on Fridays, kept falling into the comfortable rhythm of him, his laugh, his steadiness, his habit of listening. But underneath all of it, persistent and low, was the awareness that Damen Delorenzo had made a phone call on her behalf without telling her. And that she didn't know how to feel about that. She knew how she should feel. She should feel that her boundaries had been crossed, that someone had inserted himself into her professional life without her consent, however well-intentioned, and that this was not acceptable. She had spent 3 years building a life that was entirely her own architecture, where every beam and joint was something she'd placed herself, and the idea of someone else quietly reinforcing her structure without asking first, she should be angry about that. She was not angry about that. She was something more complicated and considerably less convenient. She called Damon on a Tuesday morning in the 3rd week of November. She had gotten his number from Luca's phone 2 weeks earlier, under the pretense of needing it for a state-related coordination with the Hyde Park project. She'd told herself at the time that it was purely practical. She had mostly believed herself. He answered on the second ring. Ms. Vale. No surprise in his voice. Of course not. You talked to Ferraro about Walsh, she said. No preamble. She wasn't in the mood for it. A brief pause. Yes. Without telling me. Yes. I need to understand why. The line was quiet for a moment. She could hear faintly the ambient sound of wherever he was, something low and urban, traffic maybe, the particular acoustic signature of a large building. Walsh Property Group has been running the same contract scheme on independent designers for 6 years, Damon said. 3 of them signed it. 1 lost her business entirely within 18 months. He uses the exclusivity to control their client relationships, then undercuts their rates to his subsidiaries until they can't sustain independent operation. Sienna was very still. How do you know that? Because 2 of those designers work for Walsh subsidiaries now, Damon said. And because Gordon Walsh owes me a significant amount of money from a 2019 financing arrangement he'd prefer to forget. He knows I know this. A call to Ferraro was sufficient to remind him that his campaign against your reputation carried a certain risk. The silence that followed was long enough that she heard him shift position on the other end of the line. You used leverage, she said. Yes. On my behalf. Yes. Damon. She said his name deliberately, testing the shape of it. You should have asked me first. You're right, he said, immediately, without qualification. I should have. She hadn't expected that. The clean acknowledgement of it, no explanation offered as mitigation, no pivot to why the outcome justified the method. Just, you're right. It knocked her slightly off the speech she'd prepared. Then why didn't you, she asked. Because by the time I was aware of the situation, he said, Walsh had already made 2 of the 3 calls. Waiting for your permission would have cost you Patricia Nguyen, who had called her directly, who had effectively saved her from losing a key professional relationship. Patricia still called me, Sienna said. Because I was too late to prevent the call, Damon said. Not too late to ensure she called you honestly, rather than being turned against you. She pressed 2 fingers against the space between her eyebrows. Her office was quiet around her. The good morning quiet, Maya at school, coffee going cold on the desk beside her sketches. I don't need someone managing my problems for me, she said. I know you don't, he said. That's not what I was doing. Then what were you doing? A beat of silence. Removing an obstacle, he said, that you were going to handle yourself eventually, at greater cost. That's not your decision to make. No, it's not. And I made it anyway. Another pause. I'm not apologizing for the outcome. I am acknowledging that I overstepped the process. She sat with that for a moment. The precision of the distinction, outcome versus process. Most people defending themselves would have collapsed the 2 together and offered one apology for everything. Damon had taken them apart carefully and addressed only the part that warranted addressing. That kind of thinking was either very disciplined or very dangerous. She suspected in his case it was both. Don't do it again without telling me, she said. Understood. I mean it. I know you do. She hung up. She sat in her quiet office and looked at her sketches and thought, I just negotiated terms with a man I've spoken to 4 times in my life, and it felt like the most adult conversation I've had in months. Then she thought, this is a problem. She picked up her pencil and went back to work. Luca called that evening, while she was making dinner, and Maya was at the kitchen table doing homework with the focused ferocity she brought to all activities she considered important, which included homework, classifying her stuffed animals by species, and deciding what constituted fair distribution of dessert. How's your week? He asked. His voice had the slightly too even quality she'd learned to recognize when something was bothering him that he hadn't decided how to address yet. Good, she said. Hyde Park is coming along. The plaster supplier came through. She paused. Yours? Fine. He was quiet for a beat. I had lunch with Damen today. Her hand tightened slightly on the spatula. She kept her voice completely normal. How was that? Informative, Luca said, in a tone that made the word do twice the work it usually did. He mentioned the Walsh situation. She turned the heat down on the pan. Did he? He said he'd reached out to Ferraro to preempt any damage. He seemed to think I'd want to know. A pause that had a texture to it. Did you know he'd done that? I found out recently, she said. I called him about it. You called him? To address it directly, yes. The silence on the other end of the line was the kind that had weight. She could feel Luca sorting through things, carefully, the way he sorted through most things, without rushing to conclusions that might not be fair. I appreciate that he helped, he said finally. He stopped. I would have wanted to know. If there was a problem with Walsh, if someone was undermining your work, I would have wanted to be the one who… I know, she said quietly. Did you think about calling me? The honest answer was yes. The fuller honest answer was that she had thought about calling him and then had kept working through the problem herself, the way she always kept working through problems herself. Because 3 years of being the only one responsible for her life had made self-sufficiency less a choice than a reflex. I didn't want to worry you, she said, which was also true, though incomplete. Luca let out a slow breath. Sienna, he restarted. I want to worry sometimes. I want to be the person you call. You are, she said. I found out from my brother. The kitchen was very quiet except for the sound of Maya's pencil and the low simmer from the stove. I'm sorry, Sienna said. You're right, I should have told you. I'm not angry, Luca said, and she believed him because he wasn't an angry person. He was something more wearing than angry. He was hurt, in the quiet, patient way of someone who has learned to carry hurt without making a scene of it. I just want to understand what's happening. I'm handling a difficult client situation, she said. Damon became aware of it and acted without asking either of us. I addressed that with him directly. It's handled. Another long pause. He doesn't usually involve himself in things like this, Luca said. Damon, he doesn't. The things he involves himself in tend to be, he searched for the word, larger. Maybe he was being polite to a family connection, she said. It sounded thin even as she said it. Maybe, Luca said, and she could hear in the single word that he didn't believe it either. They finished the conversation carefully, the way you finish conversations when you're both trying not to push on something that might give way. He said he loved her before he hung up. She said it back and meant it, and hated the way the words sat in her chest afterward like something not quite settled. Maya looked up from her homework. Is something wrong? 6 years old and already reading rooms better than most adults, Sienna knew. Nothing's wrong, baby. You have your thinking face. I'm always thinking. This is the other thinking face, Maya said, with absolute diagnostic confidence, and went back to her worksheet. Sienna served dinner and tried to remember the last time she'd felt simple about anything. December arrived with its particular Chicago brutality, the wind off the lake turning genuinely hostile, the gray settling into the sky like it had decided to stay. Sienna had always loved winter in the city, the way it forced intimacy, people leaning into coats, into each other, into warm rooms with fogged windows. There was something honest about it. Chicago in winter didn't pretend. The Walsh situation resolved itself quietly, the way most situations involving private leverage do. Walsh did not pursue further damage to her reputation. He did not contact her again. 2 weeks after her conversation with Damon, Scott Burnham sent another email, apologetic, awkward, saying he'd reconsidered and would like to discuss the project after the new year. She wrote back professionally and said she'd be in touch. She did not mention any of this to Luca. She told herself this was because there was nothing new to mention. Walsh was done. The situation was handled. Reopening it would only pick at the conversation they'd already had and accomplish nothing. She knew, with the honesty she applied to everything except, apparently, that this was not entirely the reason. The third time she saw Damon, she had arranged it herself. She had a reason that was professional and legitimate. Dominic Ferraro had mentioned that Damon had done the original structural assessment of the Hyde Park property and had documentation she hadn't been given access to. Architectural surveys, original material specifications, notes from the previous renovation attempt in 1987. Things she needed. Things it was entirely reasonable to request. She called Ferraro and asked. Ferraro gave her Damon's office address and said he'd let him know she'd be stopping by. She drove to the West Loop on a Wednesday morning and took the elevator to the 14th floor of a building whose lobby was unremarkable from the outside, but whose interiors, she noticed with professional attention, had been done with exceptional care. Materials chosen for quality rather than display, proportions that felt human rather than corporate. Damon's office occupied the northeast corner of the floor and had windows on 2 sides. That was the first thing she noticed. The second was that the office itself was not what she'd expected. No leather and dark wood and displays of power. It was a working space. Blueprints on one wall, framed but clearly used. She could see pencil annotations at the edges. A desk with organized papers. A long table along one wall with plans laid flat and weighted down. He was standing at the window when she came in, a coffee cup in one hand, looking out at the gray December morning over the city. He turned when she entered. Ms. Vale. I told you to call me Sienna. A brief pause. She hadn't said that actually. She'd said it now, apparently, without deciding to. Sienna, he said, like he was placing the word somewhere specific. She did not examine the effect of that, and moved directly to the table where a folder was already laid out. Ferraro said you had the 1987 documentation. It's there. He gestured at the folder. Original survey from 1924 is underneath. She opened the folder. The survey was a reproduction, careful, high quality, of the kind of document she'd spent weeks trying to source through city records. She looked through it with the focused attention she brought to anything that told her the truth about a building's bones. Damon settled into the chair across the table. Didn't speak. drank his coffee, and let her work. She appreciated this more than she wanted to. Most people, in the presence of silence, tried to fill it. Damon seemed to understand that silence had its own function. After 10 minutes, she looked up. The east wall drainage issue. The 1987 renovation tried to address it with exterior caulking. That's why it failed. Yes, the water was infiltrating from below grade, not the surface. So the fix is foundation-level waterproofing, not surface treatment. The fix is foundation-level waterproofing, he confirmed. The 1987 contractor either didn't know that or didn't want to do the more expensive work. The 87 renovation was done by... She read the name from the document. Castello Construction. Something shifted almost imperceptibly in his expression, a recognition she couldn't read the source of. Yes, he said. You know them. I knew them. Past tense. Deliberate. She looked at him for a moment. Is there anything in this building's history I should know that isn't in these documents? He was quiet for a count of 3. She'd begun to understand that his silences were calibrated, that the length of them corresponded to how carefully he was choosing what to say. The 1987 renovation was never finished, he said. The contractor defaulted. The property sat vacant for 11 years. There were certain uses of a vacant building in that neighborhood in the late 80s and 90s that left traces you may encounter during restoration. Nothing structurally significant, but you may find things in the walls. What kind of things? Evidence of the kind of business my father's organization conducted during that period, Damen said. Flat and direct, with no visible emotion. I wanted you to know before you encountered it, so it didn't surprise you. The room was very still. This building was connected to your family, she said. Peripherally. Ferraro acquired it clean in 2003. Any legal exposure was resolved then, but the history is there. He looked at her steadily. You deserve to know the full history of a space you're working to restore. I believe you understand that better than most. She looked back at him, really looked, the way she kept doing despite herself. Why did you give the building to Ferraro, she asked, if it was connected to your family? A beat. Because I was trying to put distance between myself and certain things, he said, and because Ferraro would care for it. And you wanted someone to care for it. Yes. She thought about that, about what it meant that a man with his reputation cared about the stewardship of a building, its history, its bones, the integrity of its restoration. Thank you for telling me, she said. He nodded once. She gathered the documents, carefully, respectfully, the way she handled anything that had history in it. She was almost at the door when he spoke. The commission from Walsh, the one you turned down. She stopped, turned back. I heard you turned it down before I made any calls, he said. Before Walsh started his campaign. You read the contract and turned it down on your own. Yes. Most people in your position would have signed it, he said. The money was significant. The profile of the project was significant. I know. You walked away from it because it wasn't honest. It was not a question. He was stating it the way he'd stated things before, like something he'd already established and was simply now articulating. I'm not interested in opportunity that comes at the cost of my own agency, she said. Something in his face shifted, very slightly, like a room that changes when you move one piece of furniture. Neither am I, he said, quietly, almost to himself. She left. She drove back toward Lincoln Park with the survey documents on the passenger seat and the December wind pushing against the car, and she thought about a man who had given away a building because he wanted someone to care for it properly. And she thought about her daughter's drawing on the refrigerator, and she thought about Luca's voice saying, I found out from my brother, and she thought about the particular quality of a silence that felt like it was building towards something. She was with Luca on the Friday before Christmas when the conversation she'd been avoiding finally arrived. They were at his apartment, a clean, well-ordered space in River North that reflected his personality accurately. Nothing excessive, nothing performative, everything chosen with care. He'd made dinner, she'd brought wine. Maya was at her friend Cora's for a sleepover. It should have been a good evening. It was a good evening, until it wasn't. They were on the couch after dinner, the remains of the meal on the coffee table, the city visible through the windows in its December brightness, when Luca said, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. She looked at him. His jaw was set in a way she hadn't seen before. Ask, she said. What is Damen to you? The question landed cleanly, no preamble, no protective hedge around it. He's your brother, she said carefully, and a connection through the Ferraro project. That's not what I'm asking. Luca, I'm not accusing you of anything, he said quickly, and she could hear that he meant it. That this was not an explosion but something more controlled and more troubling, the question of someone who has been thinking carefully for a long time. I'm asking because I've been watching something for 2 months and I can't name what it is, and I need to try. She was quiet. He helped with Walsh, Luca said, which, I've thought about this. I know Damen. I know how he operates. He doesn't do things like that for people he doesn't care about. He doesn't make calls to protect people he's indifferent to. He turned to look at her directly. In my whole life, I have never seen Damen make that kind of move for anyone outside the family. Maybe he was being, don't say polite, Luca said, quietly, but with an edge she hadn't heard from him before. Please don't say polite. She didn't say polite. What happened the night of the party? He asked. In the hallway. Because you told me you got lost and came back, and I believed you because I wanted to, but something has been off since that night, and I need to understand why. Sienna closed her eyes, opened them. She thought about the 11 months of her divorce, about Derek and his carefully maintained untruths, about the way she'd finally understood that the kindest thing she could have done, for both of them, was to stop allowing a lie to take up space that truth needed. I ran into Damen in the hallway, she said. I didn't know who he was. The light was bad and I... She stopped, took a breath. I mistook him for you. I kissed him. The silence that followed was the loudest thing she'd heard in a long time. Luca was very still. For how long? He said. 2 seconds. Maybe less. As soon as I realized, I pulled back immediately and, for how long have you known you had feelings for him? The question rearranged the room. I don't, she started. Sienna. His voice was not raised. It was very level, in the way that level sometimes costs everything. I'm asking you to be honest with me. I would rather have the honest thing than the comfortable thing. I have always been that person. Please. She looked at him, at the man she had chosen, carefully, practically, with all the judgment she'd rebuilt after her marriage. A good man. A genuinely good man. I don't know what I have, she said. I don't know if it's feelings or just an awareness, a disturbance. I haven't acted on anything. I've been trying to... I know you've been trying, Luca said, and the gentleness in it was almost harder to sit with than anger would have been. I'm sorry, she said. She meant it completely. He stood up, walked to the window, stood there with his back to her, looking at the city, and she watched his shoulders and thought, this is what honesty costs, and it is right that it costs this, and I would still pay it again. He's my brother, Luca said, to the window. Not accusatory, just stating a fact that contained multitudes. I know. He and I have been... There's been so much between us for so long. He turned. His face was tired in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. I love him. Underneath everything, I love him. But there is a reason we have kept careful distance. There are things that happened. He stopped, shook his head. I can't compete with what Damen is. I've never been able to compete with what he is. And I made my peace with that a long time ago in every area of my life except... He looked at her. I thought this was the one area. Luca. She stood. I chose you. You chose me when there was no comparison to make, he said. Not harshly, just accurately. You chose me before you met him. The truth of that moved through the room like a change in weather. I'm not leaving, she said. I'm not asking you to leave. He ran a hand over his face. I'm asking you to look at what's actually happening and stop pretending it isn't, because I can handle the truth. What I can't handle, his voice caught, just slightly. The only crack she'd heard in it. What I can't handle is watching someone I love manage me. That word, manage, hit her with the force of precision, because that's what she'd been doing. With the best intentions, with genuine care for him, she had been deciding what he should know and when he should know it, calibrating the truth to protect him from something he hadn't asked to be protected from. And that was a form of dishonesty that wore the clothes of consideration. She had watched Derek do it to her for years. You're right, she said. I'm sorry. You're completely right. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he came back to the couch and sat down, and she sat beside him, and they were both very quiet in the way of two people who are honest enough to sit in something difficult without running from it. I need time to think, he said finally. Okay. I'm not ending this. I don't want that. But I need to think. Okay. He reached over and took her hand, held it. She held his back. Outside the windows, Chicago glittered in its December darkness, indifferent and magnificent. She sat with the man she had chosen and the truth she had finally told him and the full weight of what was coming, and she did not look away from any of it. But later, driving home in the hard winter cold, the streets quiet in the particular way of late Friday nights, she thought about what Luca had said. I can't compete with what Damen is. And she thought he shouldn't have to. No one should have to compete with the person who is right for someone. If Luca was right for her, the question of Damen shouldn't have the gravity it had. The fact that it did have that gravity, that was the information she couldn't dismiss. She pulled into her building's garage and sat in the parked car for a moment, hands still on the steering wheel, the engine ticking as it cooled. She had told Luca the truth. It had cost something real, and underneath the cost, something she'd been holding tightly. The careful management of her own feelings, the deliberate looking away, had shifted. Because the truth, once spoken, does not permit you to go back to pretending you don't know it. She knew what she felt. She had no idea what to do with it. She got out of the car and went upstairs to her empty apartment, to Maya's drawing on the refrigerator and her plans on the desk, and her life that she had built piece by piece with her own hands, and she sat at the kitchen table in the silence. She sat at the kitchen table until 2 in the morning, not crying, not spiraling, just sitting with it, the way you sit with a wound after the initial shock has passed and you're trying to assess the actual damage before you decide how to treat it. The apartment was quiet around her in the particular way of late nights when a child is sleeping somewhere else and the ordinary sounds of a household are absent. No small feet on the floor, no requests for water or one more story. Just the refrigerator's low hum and the distant sound of the city and Maya's drawing on the refrigerator that Sienna kept looking at without meaning to. MoMA. One figure, tall. One figure, small. She thought about what she knew. She was good at inventory, at taking careful stock of what was real versus what she was imposing on reality. It was one of the things that made her good at her work. You couldn't design a space honestly if you let what you wanted it to be override what it actually was. What she actually knew, she had feelings for a man she had no business having feelings for. Her relationship with his brother was damaged. Not destroyed, but damaged in a way that would require real work to repair, if repair was what they both chose. She had a daughter who drew 2-figure pictures and needed her mother to be steady. She had a career that was, for the first time, beginning to build real momentum. She had a life that was hers. What she wanted to be true, that these things were all compatible, that she could be honest with Luca and work through it, and put the question of Damen back where it belonged, in the category of feelings that were noted and then set aside because they served no purpose. What she was less certain of, in the cold honesty of 2 in the morning, whether feelings that had found their way this deep could actually be set aside, or whether setting them aside was simply a more sophisticated form of the same management she'd already been called out for. She went to bed without resolving any of it. She slept badly. She woke at 6 when her phone buzzed, a text from Maya's friend Cora's mother confirming pickup time, and got up and made coffee and stood at the window while the city came to its gray December morning and told herself, one day at a time, one honest day. She almost made it. The call came at 9:17 on a Tuesday morning in the first week of January. She was at the Hyde Park property on the 3rd floor, supervising the beginning of the east wall drainage remediation, the foundation-level waterproofing that the 1987 contractor had refused to do properly. The crew was good. She'd vetted them herself. The work was proceeding with the careful precision she required, and she was standing in the room where the lead glass windows threw their imperfect light across the floorboards, making notes in her book, when her phone rang. The number was one she didn't recognize. She almost let it go to voicemail. Sienna Vale, she answered. Ms. Vale. A woman's voice, controlled, professional, with a tension underneath it that the control couldn't quite suppress. My name is Claire Ashworth. I'm the managing director of Ashworth Design Group. Sienna knew the name. Ashworth Design was the largest independent residential design firm in Chicago, the kind of firm that didn't call people like Sienna. I'm aware of your firm, she said carefully. I'm aware of your work, Claire Ashworth said. Specifically, I'm aware of the Hyde Park restoration and 3 residential commissions you've completed in the past year. I've been tracking your work for some time. A pause. I'd like to offer you a position as senior design director. The room felt very still. That's... Sienna stopped, started again. I'm flattered, Ms. Ashworth, genuinely, but I run an independent practice and... I know you do, Claire said. I'm not offering you an employment contract. I'm offering you a partnership track, 18 months, at the end of which we revisit the terms. You bring your existing clients. You keep your name on projects you originate. The infrastructure of the firm supports your work, contractors, suppliers, administrative support. But your creative authority is entirely intact. Sienna was quiet for a moment. Why me? She asked. And why now? Because you turned down Gordon Walsh, Claire said. And because the reason you turned him down is the same reason I've been building this firm for 20 years. We don't compromise the work for the convenience of the business. A brief pause. I also know what Walsh tried to do to you afterward. The design community in this city is smaller than people think. I've been watching how you handled it. I'd like to know where you heard about the Walsh situation, Sienna said. Her voice came out even. Multiple sources, Claire said. But the first was Dominic Ferraro, who suggested I call you. About 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks ago. Before Christmas. Before the conversation with Luca. Before the 2 a.m. inventory. Ferraro again. And behind Ferraro, the unspoken shape of who had spoken to Ferraro first. She closed her eyes briefly, opened them to the lead glass windows and the winter light coming through imperfect glass. I'd like meat, she said, before I consider anything. Of course, Claire said. Thursday? Thursday works. She hung up and stood in the room for a moment, very still, and made herself think clearly about what this meant and what it didn't mean. A legitimate professional opportunity, arriving through a chain of influence she was beginning to understand. The opportunity itself was real. Ashworth's reputation was unimpeachable. The terms as described were better than anything she'd have structured for herself at this stage. And behind it, again, the fingerprints of someone who had decided she was worth protecting. She should be angry. She had said, "Don't do it again without telling me." He hadn't told her. But standing in a room she was restoring to something it had always had the bones to be, she found that what she felt was not precisely anger. She called Damen. He answered before the second ring. You talked to Ferraro again, she said. A pause. Yes. Ashworth called me this morning. I know. You said you wouldn't. I said I wouldn't act without telling you, he said. I spoke to Ferraro 6 weeks ago, before that conversation, before you told me not to. She worked through the timeline. He was technically right. The call to Ferraro about Ashworth had preceded her request that he stop. That is an extremely precise distinction, she said. Yes, he agreed. No apology. No inflation of the distinction into something more comfortable, just acknowledgement that it was precise and he was making it anyway. She exhaled. I'm meeting with Claire Ashworth on Thursday. Good. I haven't decided anything. I know. Damen. She stopped. The workers' voices drifted up from the floor below. Ordinary sounds of ordinary labor. Why? The Walsh call I could rationalize. He owed you money. It was contained. But Ashworth, that's building something. That's constructing a path for me. The line was quiet for a long moment. Because you're better than where you are, he said. And because the design community in this city has certain gatekeepers who have been preventing that. Walsh was one. There are others. Ashworth isn't controlled by any of them. That's a professional assessment. It's also a true one. Damen. She said his name the way you say something you're trying to get a clear look at. What are you doing? The silence that followed was the longest she'd heard from him. I'm not entirely sure, he said finally. And it was the first time she'd heard something in his voice that wasn't perfectly calibrated, something unguarded, almost reluctant, like a door opened accidentally. But I'm not going to pretend I'm not doing it. She stood in the winter light for a long time after she hung up. The meeting with Claire Ashworth was on a Thursday afternoon and lasted 3 hours and was one of the most substantive professional conversations Sienna had in her career. Claire was 61 years old and had built her firm from a two-person studio in Wicker Park into a 30-person operation with projects across 5 states, without once, as far as Sienna could determine, compromising the integrity of the work. She was direct, unsentimental, and had an eye for space that Sienna recognized immediately as the real thing. Not learned, not performed, but genuine. They talked about the Hyde Park project for 40 minutes. Claire asked questions that demonstrated she had studied the existing documentation and had real opinions about the approach. By the end of the third hour, Sienna was 90% certain she was going to say yes. She asked for 2 weeks to review the partnership agreement with Carol Prentice. Claire gave her 3. She left the Ashworth offices and walked 6 blocks in the January cold before she found a bench and sat down, not because she was tired, but because she needed to stop moving and think. Her career was about to change shape, in the direction she'd always wanted it to go. And it was happening, in part, because of a man she was trying very hard not to want, who kept quietly building things in her direction. She thought about Luca. They had spoken twice since the Friday before Christmas. Both conversations had been careful and real. No pretending, no management, both of them trying to hold on to something that was fraying without gripping so hard they tore it. He had said he needed time. She was giving him time. She was trying to be honest while he decided what he needed. She took out her phone, looked at Damon's number, put the phone away, went home to Maya. The thing about the city in January, Sienna had learned, was that it stripped pretense. The cold made people impatient with anything that wasted warmth. She signed the partnership agreement with Ashworth on the 23rd of January. Carol reviewed it and pronounced it fair, genuinely fair, not contract language fair. She called her existing clients and walked each of them through what the change meant. Every single one stayed. She was sitting in her new office at the Ashworth firm on the morning of January 28th, a smaller space than she'd had before, temporarily, while they figured out the reconfiguration of the floor, when her phone rang. She didn't recognize the number. She answered. Ms. Vale. A man's voice, smooth in the particular way that suggested practice rather than warmth. My name is Richard Voss. I'm calling on behalf of a group of individuals who have a significant interest in the Delorenzo family. Her hand tightened on the phone. I think you have the wrong number, she said. I don't think I do, Voss said. I understand you're close to Luca Delorenzo and have had certain interactions with his brother. I'd like to discuss those interactions. I'm not interested in discussing anything with you. She kept her voice even, professional, the way she kept her voice when she was very close to something that felt dangerous. Ms. Vale. His tone shifted slightly. Not threatening, exactly. More like a door opening to show you what was behind it before it was opened further. I have information about the Delorenzo family's business practices that I believe is relevant to some decisions you may be making. Information that I think you'd want to have before you... Don't call this number again, she said. She hung up. She sat in her new office with its temporary furniture and the January light coming through unfamiliar windows and felt the first real cold finger of something she identified precisely as fear. Not the sharp animal kind, but the deeper, steadier kind that comes when you understand that something that seemed contained has actually been open this whole time. She called Damon. For the first time, he didn't answer. She called again 20 minutes later. Voicemail. She called Luca. He answered on the third ring, his voice slightly distracted in the way of someone at a desk. Hey, everything okay? Someone called me, she said. A man named Richard Voss. He said he represented people with an interest in your family. The distracted quality vanished from Luca's voice completely. What did he say? She told him, word for word, as accurately as she could recall it. Luca listened without interrupting. When she finished, the silence on his end had a quality she'd never heard from him before. Not the careful, considered silence of a man thinking through a complex situation. Something tighter. Something that spoke of knowledge she didn't have. Are you at your office? He asked. Yes. Stay there. I'm coming to you. Luca, what is... Please stay there, Sienna. I'll explain when I get there. He arrived 40 minutes later, and the expression came through the door of her office was the one that told her that the thing she'd been sensing at the edges of this situation, The thing she'd been telling herself was just the ordinary complication of complicated people was something larger and more serious than she'd understood. She closed her office door. He sat down across from her desk. Richard Voss works for a man named Anton Gregg, Luca said. Gregg runs a syndicate that has been trying to take over the Delorenzo network for the past 2 years. Not my side of the business, Damon's side, what's left of it. He looked at her steadily, and she could see that he was choosing honesty with the same deliberate cost she'd felt when she'd chosen it with him. Damon has been trying to dismantle the organization from the inside, quietly, for about 3 years. Transferring assets, removing himself from operations, building legitimate pathways that would make the criminal infrastructure irrelevant. Gregg has been trying to stop him because a Delorenzo-controlled network is worth significantly less to him than a destabilized one he can absorb. Sienna heard every word very clearly. Damon is trying to get out, she said. Damon has been trying to get out since our father died, Luca said. But it's not. It doesn't work like resigning. You need leverage. You need to have transferred enough power away that the thing can't pull you back. He's been doing that for 3 years. And Gregg is trying to prevent it. Gregg is trying to force a power vacuum. If Damon's influence collapses fast instead of being deliberately transferred, the network fragments, and Gregg can absorb the fragments. Luca leaned forward. The fact that Gregg called you means he's escalating. It means he's identified relationships that Damon has formed outside the organization, and he's decided to use them. The cold finger in her chest became something colder and larger. He's going to use me, she said. Not a question, understanding the mechanism. He's going to try to use the appearance of your connection to Damon to create instability, Luca said. Either by making it public in a way that damages Damon's position, or by, he stopped, or by using you as leverage directly, making Damon act in a way that serves Gregg's interests in order to protect you. She sat with this for a moment, the full shape of it. Luca. She looked at him carefully. How do you know this much about Damon's operations? He met her eyes. Because I've been helping him, he said, quietly. The legitimate real estate side has been used to transfer certain assets into clean structures. I've known what he's been trying to do for 2 years. I've disagreed with some of his methods, but the goal, a pause. The goal of getting out is one I've supported every way I can. The room rearranged itself again, more comprehensively this time. You've been helping him dismantle an organized crime network, she said. I've been helping my brother become someone who doesn't have to be what our father made him, Luca said. Yes. She looked at the man across from her. The man she'd chosen for his openness and his steadiness and his fundamental goodness, and she thought, I have been looking at one room of a very large house. What do I do about Voss? She said. Don't engage, don't respond, and he hesitated. And I think you need to talk to Damon directly, about all of it. He needs to know Gregg has approached you, and he needs to know from you, not secondhand. He's not answering his phone. He will. Luca looked at her with an expression she could not entirely read, something that held grief and resignation, and underneath both, a steadiness that was the most genuinely admirable thing she'd seen in a long time. He always answers eventually. He just sometimes needs to choose the moment. She looked at her hands, looked up. Luca, I need to ask you something. Ask. Are you telling me this because it's what I need to know, or because you've made a decision about us and this is part of it? He was quiet for a long moment. His hands were flat on his knees. She could see the effort in his stillness. Both, he said. I think both things are true, and I think they're both honest, and I think you deserve to know that they're both happening at once. The honesty of it hit her like cold water. I love you, she said. And she meant it. She meant it in every way she knew how to mean something. I know, he said. I love you too, but I think... He stopped. His jaw worked once. I think the way I love you and the way you need to be loved are going in different directions. And I think we've both known that for a while, and we've both been too... He searched for the word. Too careful with each other to say it. She didn't try to argue with it, because arguing would have been the management he'd asked her to stop. I'm sorry, she said. Don't be sorry, he said. Be careful. With Gregg. With all of it. He stood. And Sienna? He looked at her from the door, his hand on the frame, and the expression on his face was one she would keep for a long time. If Damon is worth it, and I think he might be, make sure he knows what that costs. Make sure he earns it. He needs to earn things. He never had to before. He left. She sat in her office for a very long time. Damon called back at 7:43 that evening. She was home. Maya was asleep. The apartment was in its night quiet. "Voss called you," he said, before she could speak. Not a question. "This morning." She heard him exhale, a slow, controlled sound, like a man releasing something he'd been holding. "How much did he say?" "Enough to make me afraid," she said. And then Luca came and said enough to make me understand why. A silence. "Luca," Damon said quietly, "he told me about Greg, about what you've been trying to do, about his part in it." She paused. "He told me to talk to you directly." Of course he did. And there was something in it, complex and layered, the sound of two people who had loved each other in the difficult, specific way of siblings shaped by the same damage. "Is it true," she asked, "that you've been trying to get out?" "Yes. For 3 years. 3.5. And Grieg is trying to stop you by destabilizing. Grieg is trying to stop me by making me react instead of plan," Damon said. "If he can make me respond emotionally to a threat rather than strategically, he can force a move that accelerates the collapse instead of the transition. And contacting you is him telling me he's found the thing most likely to make me react emotionally." A pause. "He's not wrong that he's found it. He's wrong about what I'll do about it." She sat down on the couch, pressed her free hand against her knee to keep it steady. "Damon, he said he has information about the family's business practices. He has documents that were taken from the organization 3 years ago, selectively curated to tell a particular story. Some of what's in them is true. Most of the context that would explain them has been removed. What story do they tell?" "The story of what the Delorenzo network was before I started dismantling it," he said, "not what I've been building it away from." "Would it destroy you? If they were released?" Another long silence. "They would make the next 18 months significantly more complicated," he said, with the precision she'd come to expect from him. "They would not stop the outcome, but they could be used to apply pressure in ways that could extend the timeline, cost people I'm trying to protect. People like Luca. People like Luca. And my mother. And Ferraro, who has been legitimately clean for 20 years but whose name appears in those documents from a period before he was." She thought about Elena Delorenzo, who had held her face in both hands and said he talks about you like he means it. She thought about Dominic Ferraro, quiet and precise and careful. "What does Greg want from you?" she asked. "He wants me to step back from the transition," Damon said. "Return control of the network to the old structure. Effectively undo 3 years of work and hand him the architecture that makes the network absorbable." "And if you don't?" "Then he uses the documents." A pause. "And whatever other leverage he identifies." The silence between them was very full. "I'm leverage," she said. Not asking, just saying it clearly, so it was real between them. "He thinks you are," Damon said. "He's trying to make me believe that the choice is between protecting you and completing the transition." "And is it?" "No." His voice was very quiet and very certain. "Because I'm not going to let you be in a position where you need to be protected by giving Greg what he wants. That's not protection. That's capitulation that endangers everyone else. So what is the choice?" "The choice," he said, and she could hear him moving on the other end of the line, the sound of a door closing, a room becoming private, "is between completing this the way I planned, which takes more time and requires you to trust me through a period where you may see things that are difficult to trust, or accelerating the timeline, which requires resources I haven't fully assembled yet and carries risk I'm not sure I can fully control." "There's a third option," she said. "There's always a third option," he said. What's yours?" "You tell me everything," she said. "All of it, not managed, not calibrated. You sit across from me and you tell me the full shape of what you're in and what you need and what the risks actually are. And then I decide what I'm willing to do with that information." The silence that followed was long enough that she thought he might not answer. "Sienna," he said finally. Her name in his voice, placed exactly the way it had been the first time he'd used it, in his office with the windows and the blueprint walls. If I tell you everything, I know what I'm asking, she said. Do you? I've been told difficult truths before, she said. I've been the person on the receiving end of a life that was larger and darker than I understood. The difference between that and this is that I'm asking, I'm choosing to know. Another silence. Tomorrow, he said. Not on the phone. Tomorrow, she agreed. She hung up and sat in the quiet of her apartment with the weight of the day settling around her, and she thought about the third option, the one she'd offered, and what it required. It required her to stop standing at the edge of something and pretending she was still deciding whether to step toward it. She had already stepped. She'd stepped the moment she called him from the Hyde Park property and said, "You talked to Ferraro." She'd stepped when she'd sat across from him in his office and asked him about the building's history and listened to his answer and thought, this man is trying to become something better than what he was, and it is costing him everything, and I understand that cost. She understood the cost because she'd paid it herself. In a different currency, for different reasons, with different stakes. But the essential structure of it, the decision to stop being defined by what had happened to you and start being defined by what you chose to do next, that she knew. She went to check on Maya, stood in the doorway of the yellow room and watched her daughter sleep, the uneven pigtails loosened against the pillow, one arm thrown over a stuffed rabbit. Two figures, one tall, one small. She was not going to be careless with this, with any of it. But she was done pretending that careful meant standing still. She went to bed. She lay in the dark. Tomorrow she would sit across from Damen Delorenzo and ask him to tell her everything, and she would listen with everything she had, and she would make a decision she would have to be able to stand behind for the rest of her life. She was afraid. The real, steady, deep kind. And underneath the fear, so close to it that they were almost the same thing, was the absolute clarity of a person who has stopped running from the truth and turned around to face it. Whatever was coming, it was coming for her now, whether she moved toward it or not. She met him on her terms. That part was deliberate. She had thought about it the night before, lying in the dark with the fear and the clarity sitting side by side in her chest. And she had decided, not his office, not the estate, not any space that belonged to his world. Her territory. The Hyde Park property, where she had been working for 3 months, where the walls were beginning to breathe again after decades of neglect, where every decision about what to preserve and what to rebuild had been hers. She got there at 7:30 in the morning before the crew arrived, walked the rooms in the January gray, coffee in hand, and let the building settle around her the way it always did. The particular quality of its silence, the way the old wood held temperature differently than new construction, the lead glass windows turning the early light into something imprecise and beautiful. Damon arrived at 8. Exactly 8. She had not given him a specific time. She heard his footsteps on the stairs, the unhurried, certain ones she'd learned to recognize, and she was standing at the east-facing window, the one that looked out over the courtyard, when he came through the door. He looked at the room first, then at her. "You chose this place deliberately," he said. "Yes." He nodded once, accepted it. He was wearing a dark coat, no tie, and he looked like a man who had not slept more than she had, which was to say, not well. There were things around his eyes she hadn't seen before. Not weakness, exactly. More like the look of someone who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and has stopped being careful about whether it shows. She gestured at the low work table she'd set up in the center of the room. Plans and documentation pushed to one side, 2 chairs pulled up opposite each other. Nothing soft about the arrangement, nothing that invited anything other than directness. He sat. She sat across from him. "Everything," she said. "Start from the beginning." He looked at her for a moment, then he started talking. It took 2 hours. She didn't interrupt. She had learned, from years of client consultations, from her marriage, from the long education of listening to people describe what they needed versus what they were asking for, that the most important information usually arrived in the pauses and the digressions, in the places where a person's account of themselves snagged on something they hadn't meant to say. Damon's account of himself did not snag often. He was precise and unflinching, and he told it the way she imagined he did everything, with a clarity that did not flinch from the difficult parts and did not dress them up. His father, Marco Delorenzo, had built the network over 30 years. It was not the cinematic version of organized crime, not glamorous, not theatrical. It was a business, a real estate operation at its legitimate surface, and underneath that, a structure of influence and enforcement and financial movement that touched every major commercial development in the city for 2 decades. Marco had been brilliant and ruthless, and had loved his sons in the particular way of men who express love through expectation. Luca had been steered toward the legitimate operations from early, protected, in a way that Damon had understood only in retrospect as his father's acknowledgement that one son should remain clean. Damon had not been protected. He said this without self-pity. It was simply the fact of it, stated plainly. When my father died, he said, I inherited the structure, all of it, the legitimate and the illegitimate, the people who depended on it, the people it was used against, the debts and the leverage and the history. He looked at his hands. I also inherited a choice I hadn't expected to have, because my father had not expected to die at 58. The choice to get out, Sienna said. The choice to dismantle it properly, he said. Getting out was never the option. You don't get out of something like this and leave the structure intact behind you. It just finds a new operator. What I could do, what I decided to do, was take it apart carefully enough that there was nothing left worth operating. 3.5 years. 3.5 years, he confirmed. Transferring assets into legitimate structures, moving influence away from enforcement and into financial operations that don't require the same infrastructure, removing the people who depended on the criminal operations and creating pathways into legitimate ones. It is, he said, with a dry precision that was almost dark humor, the most complicated project management problem I've ever encountered. Despite everything, she almost smiled. And Greg, she said. Greg identified what I was doing about 18 months in. He'd been watching for an opportunity to absorb the network for years. He was waiting for my father to die or become weak. When I inherited it and started the transition, his timeline was disrupted. Damon's jaw tightened slightly, the first visible sign of something other than composure. He has spent the past 2 years trying to create the conditions for a forced collapse. If the transition breaks down fast, the pieces scatter. He collects the pieces, the documents he has. 3 years ago, one of the people I trusted most took documentation from the organization and sold it to Greg. Not for money, for a guarantee of his family's safety under a Greg-controlled network. A pause. I understand why he did it. I don't forgive it, but I understand it. What's in the documents? Financial records, transaction histories, names. He met her eyes directly. Evidence of things that were done under my father's operation and the early part of mine before I started the transition. Things that are true. Things that, presented without context, tell a very specific story about who I am. And the context? The context is 3.5 years of work that hasn't been made public because making it public defeats the purpose of doing it quietly. He leaned forward slightly. If I announce what I'm doing, Greg accelerates. If I stay quiet, the documents look like the only truth. Sienna sat with the full shape of it. How close are you, she asked. To finishing. 18 months. Maybe less if I can secure 2 more asset transfers and close a financing arrangement that moves the last of the real estate holdings into clean structures. And if Greg releases the documents before then? The legal exposure is significant but manageable. The court of public opinion is harder. The real damage is to the people whose names are in there. Luca, my mother, Ferraro, 4 other individuals who have spent years building distance from the old operation and would be pulled back into the narrative. She looked at him. This man who had spent 3.5 years quietly, methodically, at enormous cost and complexity, trying to become something his father hadn't made space for. She thought about Maya's room painted yellow. About the choice to paint it yellow because her daughter had said yellow felt like sunshine coming from inside. About what it meant to decide, deliberately, what kind of space you were going to build. What does Greg want, she said. Specifically, what is he asking for in exchange for the documents? He hasn't stated terms yet, Damen said. The call to you was an opening move. He's establishing leverage before he names a price. So he'll call again. Or he'll send Voss again. Or he'll find another way to make contact that reminds me he has access to things I want protected. His voice was even, but she could hear, underneath it, the particular tension of a man who is controlling something that wants very much to not be controlled. He is a patient man. He'll wait until he thinks the moment is right. And what will you do when he names terms? Damon looked at her steadily. I won't give him the network. That was never an option. The question is what the refusal costs and whether I can absorb the cost without the transition collapsing. You've been planning for this. I've been planning for this for a year, he said. I have documentation of my own. 3.5 years of transition records, asset transfers, legitimate restructuring. If Grieg releases his documents and I release mine simultaneously, the picture is complete enough that the legal risk is significantly reduced. Then why haven't you done it already? Because releasing my documentation triggers the final phase of the transition before I've secured the last 2 asset transfers, he said. If I go public now, Grieg moves on those assets before I can protect them. And approximately 40 people who have been cooperating with the transition lose the protection that comes with being inside a functioning structure. 40 people. People who trusted that I would complete this, he said. People who had other options, some of them not good options, but options, and chose to wait because I told them the transition was the better path. She understood. The architecture of it, the weight of it. She had spent 3 years building a life where the decisions she made were hers and the consequences fell on her. She had raised a daughter in that structure. She understood exactly what it meant to have people trusting you to hold something together. What do you need? She said. He looked at her. Something shifted in his face. The door opening again, the same accidental way it had on the phone, something unguarded. 60 days, he said. If I can secure the last 2 transfers and close the financing in 60 days, I can release the transition documentation from a position of completion rather than defense. Grieg's documents become a partial story against a full one. The legal exposure drops to manageable. The 40 people are outside the structure and protected. And if Grieg moves before 60 days, then I deal with it as it comes, he said. It was not bravado. It was the flattest, most honest statement she'd heard him make. I don't have a clean solution for that. I have a set of contingencies that are all more costly than the 60-day option. She was quiet for a long moment. Outside, she could hear the crew beginning to arrive. Footsteps on the floor below, voices, the particular sounds of people starting work. The Voss call, she said. He called me because he thought it would provoke you. Yes. He was right that it would provoke you. Damon was very still. Yes. But you're not going to let it. I'm trying not to. His voice dropped slightly. It's the most difficult thing I'm currently managing. She looked at him. This man who held 40 people's safety in a structure he was dismantling piece by careful piece, who had spent 3.5 years becoming someone his father had never intended him to be, who had looked at a woman in a dark hallway 2 seconds after she'd kissed him by mistake, and decided apparently that she was worth noting. Tell me about the 2 asset transfers, she said. He blinked, just slightly. What? The 2 transfers you need to complete in 60 days. Tell me what they are. What's blocking them? Sienna, you said you needed 60 days. I'm asking what's standing between you and 60 days. He looked at her for a long moment, reading her the way he read everything, carefully, completely, with the full weight of his attention. One is a real estate holding in Michigan, he said slowly. It needs to go into a trust structure that Luca has been administering. The paperwork is complete. The delay is a third-party lien that appeared 6 weeks ago from a creditor I can't identify, which I believe is Grieg applying pressure through a proxy entity. And the other? A financing arrangement with a private equity firm. The firm is legitimate. The arrangement is legitimate. The managing partner has been stalling for 8 weeks. His name is Christopher Hale. She went still. Christopher Hale, she repeated. You know him. He's been in conversations with Claire Ashworth about a co-investment in a development project, she said carefully. I've met him twice in the past 3 weeks. The room was very quiet. Grieg has influence with Hale, Damen said. Not a question. Working through it in real time, the same way she was. I don't know that for certain, she said. But if Grieg is applying pressure through proxy entities, he'd use Hale to stall the financing. Damon's jaw tightened. Which means the 60-day timeline I thought I had is already compromised. The morning light through the lead glass windows made its imprecise patterns on the floorboards. She looked at them for a moment, thought about what she knew about Christopher Hale, the 2 meetings, The things he'd said about risk tolerance and long-term positioning, and the particular way he'd asked about Ashworth's client roster with just slightly more interest than the question warranted. She thought about what she knew about buildings that had been damaged from below grade, how the surface treatment never held, how you had to go to the foundation. "I need to make a call," she said. "Sienna, give me 20 minutes. She stood. "And don't do anything while I'm making it." She saw something in his face she hadn't expected. Not resistance, but something almost like surprise. As if he wasn't accustomed to someone telling him to wait and finding that he was willing to. She went to the hallway, called Carol Prentice. Carol answered on the second ring with the even-keeled efficiency of a woman who had been handling problems since before Sienna knew what problems were. "I need to know about proxy lien filings," Sienna said. "Specifically, how you'd trace a lien that appeared on a real estate holding 6 weeks ago to its beneficial owner if the filing entity is a shell." A brief pause. "Are we talking about something you're personally exposed to?" "No, someone I'm trying to help." "Give me the property details." She went back into the room and got them from Damen: address, county, filing date, the name of the entity. Read them back to Carol. "I'll make some calls," Carol said. "Couple of hours." "Thank you." She hung up, looked at Damen, who had been watching her with an expression she couldn't entirely read. "Your attorney," he said. "She's good," Sienna said simply. "She handled my divorce. She's seen worse than a proxy lien." He was quiet for a moment. "You don't have to do this," he said. "I know I don't have to," she said. "That's not the relevant question." "Then what is the relevant question?" She looked at him directly. The full weight of what she knew, what she'd decided, what it cost. "Whether you can complete what you started," she said. "Whether 60 days is real or whether it's already slipping. Whether the 40 people you're responsible for are actually going to land somewhere safe." A pause. "And whether you're going to let me help or spend the next 60 days trying to keep me outside something I'm already inside." The silence that followed was the longest of the morning. "I already tried to keep you outside it," he said. "From the beginning. The Walsh situation, the Ashworth call. All of it was—" He stopped, started again. "I was trying to solve problems in your life from a distance so that you wouldn't have to come any closer to mine." "I know," she said. "It didn't work." "No," she agreed. "It didn't." He looked at her with those deep, still eyes, and she looked back at him, and the room held them in its winter light, and she thought, "This is it. This is the moment where I either step back or I don't." And she found, with a clarity that surprised her only because she'd expected to feel more conflicted about it, that she was not stepping back. "Tell me about Christopher Hale," she said. "Everything you know." Carol called back at 11:47. Sienna was on the second floor by then, supervising the restoration of a plaster medallion that had survived a century intact, when her phone buzzed. She stepped into the hallway. "The lion was filed by an entity called Meridian Property Solutions," Carol said. "LLC, Delaware registered, formed 14 months ago. The registered agent is a filing service with 600 other clients, but—" The slight satisfaction in Carol's voice was the sound of a good lawyer finding the thread. "Meridian shares an address with a company called Redfield Capital Group, and Redfield Capital Group has a managing partner named Anton Gregg." Sienna closed her eyes, opened them. "Thank you, Carol." "Do you want me to proceed with anything?" "Not yet. I'll call you." She went back downstairs. Damen was at the long table, phone out, a legal pad in front of him covered in notes. He looked up when she came in. "The lien is Gregg," she said, "through a Delaware LLC called Meridian. It shares an address with Redfield Capital Group." Something moved across his face, fast and cold, and controlled back almost immediately. "He filed 6 weeks ago." "Which means he knew about the Michigan transfer 6 weeks ago," Sienna said. "Which means someone inside the transfer process told him." Damen's voice was very quiet, very level, the particular quality of something being contained at significant effort. "Yes. You have another breach." "Apparently." He set the phone down on the table with deliberate care. She watched him work through the implications. She could see it happening behind his eyes, the rapid and systematic processing of a mind that was genuinely exceptional at what it did. "The lien can be challenged," she said. Carol says the filing entity has insufficient standing if the underlying debt claim is fabricated, which she believes it is based on the formation timeline. It would take 3 to 4 weeks to resolve legally. 3 to 4 weeks I don't have, he said. Or, she said, you challenge the lien publicly and simultaneously release the transition documentation. Don't wait for the 60-day ideal. Move from the position you're in rather than the one you plan to be in. The financing isn't closed. Then close it without Hale. Who else? There isn't time to find another. Claire Ashworth, Sienna said. He looked at her. The co-investment Hale was discussing with her. She was interested in the underlying project, not in Hale specifically. If the Delorenzo asset is part of a legitimate development portfolio with clear transition documentation, she won't touch anything with the Delorenzo name on it. She might, Sienna said carefully, if the documentation is clear and the transition is provable and the person vouching for its legitimacy has credibility with her. A pause. Which I do. The room was very still. You'd put your name on this, he said. Wasn't quite a question and wasn't quite not one. I'd present the documentation to Claire and let her make an informed decision, Sienna said, which is not the same thing. But yes, my name is part of why she'd take the meeting. If this goes wrong, I know what happens if it goes wrong, she said. I've thought about it. I'm a 34-year-old single mother with a daughter who depends on me and a career I spent 3 years rebuilding, and I know exactly what's at stake for me. She met his eyes. I'm still telling you I'll do it. He stood up from the table. The movement was sudden enough that she took a small step back, but he didn't come toward her. He went to the window, stood with his back to her, looking out at the courtyard, his hands at his sides. She waited. I have spent 3.5 years, he said to the window, doing this alone, deliberately, because involving other people meant exposing them to risk, and I had already spent enough years watching what exposure to the Delorenzo network did to people who hadn't chosen it. I'm choosing it, she said. I know. He turned, and his face, in the winter light, was the most open she'd seen it. The composure still there, but thinner, like ice over water you could see through. That's what I'm trying to... He stopped. His hand came up and pressed against the back of his neck, and it was such an unguarded gesture, so far from the perfect stillness she'd come to expect, that it caught her breath. Nobody has chosen this before. Nobody who didn't have to. Your brother, she said quietly. Luca chose the transition, he said. He didn't choose... He stopped again. He didn't choose you, she said. Not like this. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It had the texture of something settling, something that had been held at tension for a long time, finding a resting place. 60 days was theoretical, he said finally. The real timeline, assuming the Michigan transfer is blocked and Hale is compromised. 30 days, she said, if we move fast. 30 days is possible, she said. Difficult, but possible. He looked at her across the room. This room that she had spent months restoring, carefully, with full knowledge of its history and its damage and its bones, because she believed that things worth building were worth the full cost of building them correctly. I need to make calls, he said. Make them. He was already reaching for his phone when it buzzed with an incoming call. He looked at the screen, his jaw set. Greg, he said. She watched him. He looked up at her. Answer it, she said. Sienna. Answer it, she said again, steadier. Let him tell you what he wants, and then we know exactly what we're dealing with. He held her eyes for one more second, then he answered. Greg. His voice was flat and cool and entirely composed. The voice of a man who had been doing this for 3.5 years and was not going to let today be the day it showed. Talk. She could hear faintly the voice on the other end of the line, smooth and unhurried, the voice of a patient man who believed he had the winning position. She watched Damon's face as he listened, watched the stillness of him, the absolute, practiced, hard-won stillness. And underneath it, in the set of his jaw and the way his free hand tightened once, just once, against his thigh, the thing it cost. Greg talked for approximately 3 minutes. When he finished, Damen said, I'll need 48 hours. A response from Greg. 48 hours, Damen repeated. Non-negotiable on my end. He hung up. The room was very quiet. He wants the network intact and under Greg-controlled management within 2 weeks, Damen said. In exchange, the documents disappear, and the lien is withdrawn, and no further action is taken against anyone connected to the Delorenzo name. And if you refuse, the documents go to 3 federal prosecutors and 2 investigative journalists simultaneously, and he makes a second move that he didn't specify, the unspecified second move. He knows where Maya's school is, Damen said. Very flat, very even, like a man holding something extremely volatile with both hands and not moving. He mentioned the name of her classroom teacher. The cold that moved through Sienna was absolute. She stood in the room where she had spent 3 months rebuilding something worth keeping, and she felt the full weight of the 34 years of her life, the marriage, the divorce, the city she'd come to alone, the daughter she'd raised alone, the career she'd built alone. And she felt it all stripped back to its essential question: what are you willing to do, and what will you not do, and where exactly is the line? She looked at Damen. His face was for the first time not composed. He was watching her with an expression that held something she recognized because she'd felt it herself every day for 6 years. The specific terror of a person who has something they can't afford to lose. He's not going to touch her, Damen said. His voice was different now, lower, stripped of the professional evenness, something rawer underneath. I want to be very clear about that. Whatever else happens, that will not happen. I know, she said. Her own voice came out steadier than she expected. I can move faster than 30 days if I have to. Damen! She said his name the way she'd learned to say it, placed, deliberate, with the full weight of who she'd decided he was. I know, I believe you, but we need to be smarter than he is, not just faster. What are you thinking? She thought about buildings damaged from below grade, about surface treatments that didn't hold, about the only fix being foundation level. He's expecting you to either capitulate or react, she said. He's not expecting documentation to go public before his deadline. He's counting on you needing the 48 hours to decide. We can't get everything ready in less than 48. We don't need everything, she said. We need enough. Enough documentation to create a counter-narrative that makes his documents incomplete. Enough to show the transition is real and provable and already largely complete. Enough that when 3 federal prosecutors and 2 investigative journalists receive Greg's package, there's already a competing version of the truth in the public record. He was very still. If I release now, the Michigan transfer is blocked anyway, she said. The Hale financing is compromised. The ideal 60-day scenario is already gone. So the question isn't whether you release from a perfect position. It's whether you release from yours before he releases from his. She watched him process it, the rapid, systematic intelligence of him working through the implications, the contingencies, the risks. The 40 people, he said. How many of them are already in positions that would survive public documentation of the transition? She asked. 31, he said. Without hesitation, he knew the number exactly. And the other 9? 7 are in transition, 2 are still... He stopped. Still inside the old structure. Yes. Can you move them in 48 hours? He looked at her. I can move them in 24. Then we have a plan, she said. She pulled out her phone, dialed Claire Ashworth. Claire answered on the 3rd ring. Sienna, I wasn't expecting. I need an urgent meeting, Sienna said. Today, if possible. I have documentation related to the Delorenzo asset transfer, and I need you to see it before a decision is made that will affect both of us. A pause from Claire. Careful. Measuring. This afternoon, Claire said. 3 o'clock. Thank you. She hung up. Looked at Damen. 3 o'clock with Ashworth, she said. What documentation can you have assembled in 4 hours? He was already on his phone. Give me 2 hours and I'll have the core transition record. 4 years of asset transfers, legitimization filings, regulatory compliance documentation for the structures that are already clean. And someone who can verify it independently? Someone with standing that Ashworth will recognize? Ferraro, he said. He's been part of the legitimate end for 20 years. He can speak to the restructuring from the inside. Call him. He called. She listened to the conversation. Damen's side of it, precise and fast. The compressed efficiency of someone who had been doing this long enough that he could lay out complex information in 4 sentences. Ferraro said yes before the 4th sentence was finished. She called Carol Prentice and explained what she needed for the lien challenge. Carol said she could have preliminary filings ready by end of day. They worked in the Hyde Park room for 2 hours with the crew, sounds drifting up from below, and the lead glass windows doing their imprecise work with the winter light, and she thought, this is what it looks like. Not a hallway in the dark and a mistake made in 2 seconds. This. 2 people at a table with their phones and their knowledge and the full weight of what they're trying to protect, working the problem as fast as they can. At 12:47, Damon's phone buzzed. He looked at the screen. Something changed in his face. What? She said. The second move, he said. The one he didn't specify on the phone. He turned the screen so she could see it. It was an email, sent to Luca's professional email address, which Damon had apparently been monitoring. The subject line was blank. The body contained 3 attachments and 4 sentences. The 4 sentences told Luca that his brother had been conducting a 3.5-year operation using Luca's real estate business as cover, without Luca's full knowledge of the scope, and that the attached documentation proved that Luca's name appeared on filings that constituted knowing participation in the dissolution of an organized crime network, which, depending on the prosecutor's interpretation, could be read as either cooperation with law enforcement or as complicity in the original enterprise. The attachments were selectively curated. She could see that from the file names. 3 documents that would tell a story whose context had been surgically removed. He's going after Luca, she said. He's going after everyone I've tried to protect. Damon's voice had gone to a place she hadn't heard before, not cold, not composed. Something underneath those things, something that was the foundation they'd been built on top of. He wants me to understand that there is no version of this where I refuse and the people I care about are safe. She looked at him. Has Luca seen this? I don't know. The email arrived 4 minutes ago. She picked up her phone and called Luca. He answered on the first ring. His voice was tight. I just got an email. I know, she said. Don't respond to it. Don't forward it. Don't delete it. We're moving. 48 hours. A silence. Sienna. His voice was different from anything she'd heard from him. Not the careful, considered Luca, not the hurt Luca from the couch that Friday night. Something harder and more decided. What do you need from me? She looked at Damen. Damon said, tell him I need the Michigan trust documents released to a third-party escrow today. He has standing to do it unilaterally under the existing agreement. She relayed it. Luca was quiet for 2 seconds. Done, he said. I'll have it to escrow by 2. Thank you, she said. Sienna. His voice dropped slightly. Be careful. I will. She hung up. The room was very still. Damon was watching her with the expression she'd first seen in the hallway, the deep, still attention of a man who was looking at something he hadn't expected. But it was different now, less contained, like a window that had been closed for a long time and was finally open. You just coordinated both of us with my brother, he said. Yes. He agreed. He's a good person, she said. He's always been a good person. You both are. You're just... She stopped. Complicated, he said. Human, she said. Something moved across his face, the same movement she'd seen in pieces. The door, the imperfect light, the unguarded gesture of his hand at his neck. All of it coming together into something she could finally read clearly. The 3 o'clock meeting with Ashworth, he said. If she says no, she won't, Sienna said. But if she does, we find another way. We still have the documentation. We still have the lien challenge. We still have 48 hours and a plan that is better than no plan, which is what we had this morning. And if Grieg moves before we're ready? She met his eyes, held them. Then we deal with it as it comes, she said, with his own words given back to him. And she saw the recognition move through him, that she had heard everything, remembered everything, was using it. He crossed the room, not fast, not dramatic, the same unhurried certainty she'd first heard in his footsteps on a staircase, and she stood her ground and looked up at him when he stopped close enough that she could see the lines of exhaustion around his eyes, and the precise quality of his attention, and the thing underneath the composure that had been there from the beginning, and that she'd been telling herself she wasn't seeing. You kissed me in a dark hallway 4 months ago, he said, by mistake. Yes, she said, and here we are. Here we are, she agreed. He reached up and put one hand alongside her face. Not a grip, not possession, just contact, just the weight of his hand against her jaw. And she felt the steadiness of it, the absolute lack of performance in it, the realness. After this is over, he said, quietly, like a promise being made at the level where promises actually live. After this is over, she said. He lowered his hand, stepped back, picked up his phone. I need to make calls, he said. Make them, she said. I'll drive. And the 30 days that would determine everything began in a room full of imperfect light, with two people who had found each other in a wrong-turn hallway and taken 4 months to understand what that meant, moving as fast as they had ever moved towards. The drive to Ashworth's office took 22 minutes. Damon spent 19 of them on the phone. She drove and listened to his side of 4 separate conversations. With his attorney, with Ferraro, with someone he called only by last name who spoke little and seemed to understand everything, and finally with a woman whose voice Sienna could hear clearly enough through the car's quiet to recognize as Elena Delorenzo. That call was the shortest. 3 minutes. Damon told his mother, in the even, careful voice he used for things that cost him, that there was going to be public documentation in the next 48 hours and that her name would appear in it, and that he was sorry she would have to go through that. Elena said something Sienna couldn't fully hear. Damon was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I know, Mama, I know. And his voice, for those 4 words, was entirely different from every other version of it she'd heard. Younger, more exposed. The voice of someone who had spent a long time being armored and was, in this particular moment, not. He hung up, looked out the passenger window at the January city moving past. She's not angry, Sienna said. She's been waiting for this for 3 years, he said. She knew I was working toward it. She didn't know the details. She knew the direction. A pause. She asked if I was doing it alone. What did you tell her? He looked at her. No. She kept her eyes on the road, felt the weight of the single word, and let it sit. Claire Ashworth met them in a conference room on the 22nd floor, with windows facing the lake and the kind of afternoon light that made everything look both clear and slightly merciless. Ferraro was already there when they arrived. He must have driven faster, or left earlier, or simply moved with the quiet urgency of a man who understood what was at stake and had been waiting for 3 years to be on the right side of it publicly. Claire looked at Damon when he walked in and did not offer her hand immediately. She looked at him the way Sienna had seen her look at a design problem, fully, without hurrying to conclusion. Mr. Delorenzo, she said. Ms. Ashworth. His voice was neutral, respectful without being deferential. You understand, Claire said, that I have spent 20 years keeping my firm's reputation entirely separate from anything connected to your family's name. I understand that, he said, and I'm asking you to look at documentation that explains why, in approximately 18 months, the name Delorenzo will be connected to a restructuring rather than an organization, and why your involvement in the final phase of that restructuring would be documented as part of the legitimate transition record. Claire looked at Sienna. You vouch for this, Claire said. Not a question, an assessment. I vouch for the documentation, Sienna said carefully. I've spent the last 6 hours reviewing it with Carol Prentice. It's real. The transition is real. The timeline is real. She paused. And I vouch for the man presenting it, which I recognize carries a different kind of weight, and I'm offering it anyway. Something moved in Claire's face. Recognition, perhaps, of what it meant for someone with Sienna's position to say that in this room. Show me the documents, Claire said. They sat for 90 minutes. Ferraro spoke for 40 of them. 20 years of legitimacy speaking to 20 years of legitimacy. 2 people who had built real things and knew what real things looked like, going through the documentation line by line. Claire asked questions that were sharp and specific and demonstrated that she understood exactly what she was looking at. Damon answered everyone without hedging, without softening, without once suggesting the picture was cleaner than it was. At the end of the 90 minutes, Claire sat back in her chair and looked at the lake for a long moment. The lien on the Michigan property, she said. Carol Prentice is filing the challenge this afternoon, Sienna said. The underlying debt claim is fabricated. She expects it to be discharged within 3 weeks. And Hale. Hale is out, Claire said flatly. I terminated that conversation this morning when I couldn't get a straight answer about the source of his hesitation. She looked at Damen. I didn't know why until now. He was being used to stall the financing, Damen said. I assumed something like that. Claire tapped one finger on the table once. The financing structure you need. What's the instrument? Damon laid it out. Numbers, timeline, terms. She listened with the complete focus of someone who had made significant financial decisions for 2 decades and had never once made one carelessly. When he finished, she was quiet for 30 seconds. I want an independent audit of the transition documentation before I sign anything, she said. I want my attorney involved in drafting the financing agreement, and I want a clause that makes my involvement contingent on the lien being discharged cleanly. Agreed, Damon said, immediately. And I want Sienna credited as the originating contact on any documentation that enters the public record regarding this arrangement. Sienna looked at her. Your name needs to be attached to something that demonstrates judgment rather than just competence, Claire said, with the directness of someone who had thought about this before the meeting. This is going to be a significant piece of the public record. Your name belongs on it. Sienna thought about the Walsh contract and its 40 pages of carefully worded erasure. She thought about what it meant to have your name attached to something that was true. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me, Claire said. Do the work. She stood, extended her hand to Damon. Mr. Delorenzo, I will be watching this very carefully. I'd expect nothing less, he said, and shook it. Griggs' documents went to the federal prosecutors and the 2 journalists at 9:17 the following morning. Damon's documentation went out at 9 o'clock. 17 minutes. That was the margin. Sienna had been in Damon's office from midnight to 8:45, with Ferraro and Damon's attorney and a woman named Sarah Kwan, who turned out to be a forensic accountant who had been working with Damen quietly for 2 years and who was the most precise human being Sienna had ever shared a room with. Carol Prentice had been on a conference line from her home office. Luca had driven in at 2 in the morning with a box of physical documentation and stayed until 6. The 5 of them had built the public record of the Delorenzo transition in 8 hours. At 8:45, Damon had looked around the room at the people in it and said, "Thank you." 2 words, simple, but said with the full weight of someone who did not use them lightly. Sarah Kwan had nodded once and gone back to her laptop. Ferraro had said, "It's past time." Carol on the phone had said, "I'm sending the lien challenge filing now. Someone give me a coffee." Luca had looked at his brother across the room, a long look, carrying everything 2 people can accumulate over a lifetime of loving each other through damage, and said nothing. And Damon had looked back, and the nothing between them had held more than most conversations. Sienna had watched this and understood that some things were not hers to be part of, and were not diminished by that. At 9 o'clock, the documentation was released simultaneously to the 3 federal prosecutors Grieg had targeted, the same 2 journalists, 4 major legal news outlets, and a public filing that entered the transition record formally into the regulatory database for financial restructuring. At 9:17, Grieg's package arrived in the same inboxes. By 10 o'clock, 2 of the journalists had called for comment. Damon's attorney handled both calls with the prepared statement they'd drafted at 4 in the morning. At 11:32, Carol called Sienna. The lien challenge has been accepted for expedited review, she said. The filing entity can't substantiate the underlying debt. I expect discharge within 2 weeks, not 3. Thank you, Carol. You've had an interesting January, Carol said. Yes, Sienna agreed. I have. The federal inquiry that opened in the following weeks was not the catastrophe Grieg had designed it to be. It was, as Damon had predicted with the precision of someone who had spent 3 years planning for exactly this, a complicated and costly process that was nonetheless survivable. 3 prosecutors reviewed the documentation. 2 of them, within a month, characterized the transition as a cooperation-adjacent restructuring and indicated they would not pursue charges against parties who had participated in the legitimate phase. The 3rd took longer. Luca's exposure, which Grieg had tried to weaponize, resolved itself when the full transition documentation made clear that his involvement had been in the legitimate real estate structures throughout. His attorney spent 6 weeks in conversations with federal representatives and emerged with a clean bill. Elena Delorenzo gave 1 interview to a journalist she chose herself, 3 weeks into the inquiry. She spoke about her late husband with the clear-eyed restraint of a woman who had loved someone complicated and had spent a long time deciding how honest to be about it. She spoke about her sons. She said, Damon has been trying to fix something broken for a long time. I think most people understand what that takes. The interview was the most read piece the outlet published that month. Ferraro's name appeared in the documentation as Grieg had intended, connected to the early period. His 20 years of clean operation and his active role in the transition restructuring were documented alongside it. His attorney released a statement. The legal exposure was reviewed and ultimately not pursued. Grieg was not destroyed by any single event. He was eroded. The Michigan property lien was discharged. The documentation he had released, presented alongside Damon's counter-record, told a story that was accurate but incomplete. And the incompleteness was visible enough that 3 of the journalists who'd received his package ran pieces about the manipulation of the documentary record, rather than straightforward exposés about the Delorenzo network. One of them ran an investigation into Grieg's own proxy entities, including Meridian Property Solutions, that resulted in a regulatory filing against Redfield Capital Group 6 weeks later. Anton Gregg did not get the network. He did not get the collapse. He did not get the leverage he'd spent 2 years accumulating. What he got was a situation that cost him more than it cost the people he'd tried to destroy. It was not a clean victory. It was not a movie ending. It was the kind of outcome that real difficult things produce. Partial, costly, imperfect, and real. Sienna told Maya about Luca in the way she tried to tell her daughter all difficult things, honestly, in language appropriate to 6 years old, with no pretense that it wasn't sad. She said that she and Luca had decided they were better as friends than as people who were together, and that this was sometimes how things went between adults, and that it didn't mean anything bad about him or about their time together. Maya had been quiet for a moment, in the way she was quiet when she was processing something she took seriously. "Is he still going to come to the museum?" she asked. "I think maybe sometimes, yes, if you'd like that." "I liked him," Maya said. "Me too, baby. Me too." Maya nodded once, the decisive nod of a 6-year-old who has reached a conclusion and is ready to act on it, and asked if they could have pancakes for dinner because sometimes you just needed pancakes. They had pancakes for dinner. Sienna cried a little in the kitchen when Maya wasn't looking. Not from devastation, from the particular grief of something real and good that had been real and good and was now changed into something else that might also be good but was not the same. That grief deserved acknowledgement. She gave it 20 minutes and a paper towel. And then she made the batter and they ate at the kitchen table, and Maya told her about a disagreement between 2 of her stuffed animals that had apparently been escalating for days. It was, as evenings went, exactly what she needed. She met Luca for coffee 6 weeks after the transition documentation went public. A place near his office, neutral territory, a Tuesday morning in late February when the cold was beginning to consider relenting. He looked good, tired around the eyes still, but a different kind of tired, the kind that comes after something hard has passed, rather than the kind that comes from carrying it. His attorney had called the day before to confirm the final clearance of his legal exposure, and she imagined he'd slept better the past 2 nights than he had in months. "How are you?" she asked. "Honestly?" He wrapped his hands around his coffee cup. "Relieved, in ways I didn't expect to be." He looked up. "The inquiry, the whole thing. I'd been carrying the knowledge of what Damon was doing for 2 years, trying to help quietly, not being able to talk about it. It was," he exhaled, "it was its own kind of weight. It's over now. The worst of it." He nodded. "There'll be proceedings that take years, documentation reviews, but the active danger of it, yes, that's over." She looked at him across the small table, the man who had listened to her like she was worth hearing, who had introduced her to his mother with genuine pride, who had sat across from her on a couch one December night and asked her to stop managing him and had been right. "I'm sorry," she said, "for the parts that were mine, the parts where I wasn't honest enough, soon enough." "I know," he said. "I'm sorry too, for—" He paused. "I think I knew, before you did, that something was pulling between you and Damon, and I kept quiet about it because I wanted to be wrong. Staying quiet about it was its own dishonesty. We were both managing each other." "We were," he agreed. "We were very careful and very considerate, and neither of us said the true thing until it cost something." She thought about that. The particular failure mode of 2 good people being too careful with each other. "Are you okay?" she asked. Really asking. He was quiet for a moment. Then he smiled. And it was a real smile, tired but genuine. The smile of someone who has decided to be okay and means it. I'm going to be, he said. There's a woman, a colleague. She's been patient with me through all of this in ways I didn't ask for and didn't deserve. He looked slightly embarrassed, in the way of someone who has been surprised by good fortune. I think I'd like to find out if that's something. Sienna felt the particular bittersweet warmth of that, real gladness for him, and under it the small, irreducible sadness of a thing fully ending. Good, she said. That's genuinely good. And you? He looked at her with the clear, open gaze that had been the first thing she'd trusted about him. You and Damen, she considered how to say it accurately. Taking it at the pace it should go, not rushing it, not managing it. That sounds like both of you. I think it is. He nodded, looked down at his coffee, looked up. He's a better person than the name that was put on him, Luca said. He always was. He just had to spend a long time proving it to himself. I know, she said. Don't let him do it alone. He said it directly, without sentimentality. A request from a brother rather than an ex. He has a habit of deciding he should solve everything himself. It's going to take someone willing to tell him when he's doing it. I've noticed, she said. He smiled again. I imagine you have. They finished their coffee, stood outside on the February street for a moment, the wind off the lake cold but noticeably less hostile than January's had been. He hugged her. She hugged him back. It was the hug of two people who had meant something to each other and had been honest enough in the end about what they meant. Take care of that kid, he said. Always, she said. He walked back toward his office. She stood on the street and watched him go, and then turned in the other direction, toward the parking garage, toward the rest of the day, toward the work she had to do. The Hyde Park restoration was completed in the third week of March. Sienna did the final walkthrough alone, early on a Saturday morning before anyone else arrived. The crew had finished the week before. The space was clean and quiet and entirely itself. The bones of it restored, the history of it honored, the damage addressed at the level where the damage had actually been, rather than at the surface where it had been visible. The lead glass windows threw their imperfect light across floors that had been refinished with the original species of wood, matched from a mill she'd tracked down in Michigan. The east wall was dry. The plaster medallions were intact. The rooms had the quality she always worked toward and rarely fully achieved. They felt like what they had always been trying to be. She stood at the east-facing window for a long time. She thought about Damen telling her about the water damage before she'd discovered it herself. About the way he'd looked at these windows and said, makes the room feel like it has history. About the fact that he had given this building to someone who would care for it, years before he'd known she existed, because he wanted something to be cared for properly. She took out her phone and took one photograph. Not for documentation. For herself. Ferraro arrived at 9 to do his final walkthrough as the owner's representative. He walked the rooms with the contained pleasure of a man who has been patient for a long time and is watching the patience pay out correctly. It's right, he said finally, standing in the main room on the second floor. It's exactly right. The bones were good, she said. It just needed someone to believe in them. He looked at her with the quiet precision that characterized everything about him. Damen said that about you once, he said. Not about the building. She absorbed this, filed it. He's going to be all right, she said. Not a question. The inquiry will take time, Ferraro said. The complete legal resolution. Years, possibly. There are costs still being paid. There will be more. He paused. But yes, he's going to be all right. I've known him since he was 19 years old, and I have never seen him as certain of his direction as he is now. She looked at the imperfect light. Neither have I, she said, though she'd known him for considerably less time. The certainty of it did not bother her. Damen came to the building that afternoon. He did what he always did in this building, looked at the rooms first, before he looked at her. She had come to understand this as a form of respect rather than distraction. He looked at what she'd made before he looked at the person who'd made it. He went through slowly. She followed. Neither of them spoke for a while. He stopped in the east-facing room, looked at the windows, looked at the floor. You kept the glass, he said. I always was going to. He turned and looked at her. And his face, in the imperfect afternoon light, was the most open she'd seen it. Not the door accidentally ajar, not the controlled revelation of a man choosing what to share. Just him. The full weight of him, present and unguarded, looking at her the way people look at things they have decided are worth looking at completely. The inquiry could take 3 years, he said. The legal resolution, longer. My name is going to be in documentation and proceedings and public records for a long time. There are going to be difficult months. He was not saying this to warn her off. She understood that. He was saying it because he had learned, through all of this, to state the full true thing rather than the comfortable version. I have spent 3.5 years building a life that is different from what I came from, and most of that work is done. But the work of being different from what I was it doesn't have a completion date. I know, she said. You have a daughter. I know. And a career that is Damen. She said his name the way she'd learned to say it, placed, deliberate, full. I have heard everything you've told me from the beginning, including the parts you didn't intend to tell me. I know who you are. I know what it cost you to become who you are. I know what's still being paid. She paused. And I have a 6-year-old who classified all her stuffed animals by species and drew a picture of me and labeled it MoMA because she has opinions about spelling, and I have a career that is finally going in the direction it should, and a life that is genuinely mine. She looked at him steadily. I'm not walking into this without knowing what it is. I'm walking into it because I know what it is. He was very still. You kissed me in a dark hallway, he said. By mistake, she said, and you've been figuring out ever since whether it was one. She looked at him. The full length of everything that had happened between a dark hallway in October and a restored building in March. The wrong turns, the honest conversations, the costs paid, and the ones still coming. It wasn't a mistake, she said. The moment was a mistake. The person was right. He crossed the room, not with the unhurried certainty she'd learned to read as his particular form of composure, with something different, something less controlled, the movement of a man who has stopped performing equilibrium. He stopped close enough that she could see the lines the past months had added to his face, close enough to feel the warmth of him, and he raised both hands and held her face the way he had in the aftermath of their conversation about Greg, but differently now. Then it had been contact, steadiness, a point of reference. Now it was something more specific and more honest. He kissed her. Not the wrong hallway version, accidental and confused and 2 seconds long. This one was deliberate. This one was chosen. This one had the full weight of everything they knew about each other behind it, and made no attempt to be lighter than that weight. When they separated, he kept his hands where they were, her face in his palms, and she kept her hands where they had ended up, flat against his chest, feeling his heartbeat. Which was not, she noted with the clarity she brought to everything real, entirely steady. She was glad about that. She didn't want him to be steady. She wanted him to be here. After this is over, she said. What she'd said in October, the beginning of a promise neither of them had known how to finish then. It's not going to be over for a long time, he said. I know. You said that already. I'm going to keep saying it, she said, until you stop finding reasons to make sure I do. He looked at her, and then he did something she hadn't seen from him before. He laughed, not the almost smile, not the dry precision, an actual laugh, brief and real and surprised out of him, and it changed his face entirely. She thought, there it is. That's the man inside all the composure. That's who he's been building toward. She thought, I want to know that person. She thought, I'm going to. 1 year later. Maya was 7 years old and had recently revised her opinion that pigtails were the correct hairstyle, pivoting instead to a single braid that she required to be perfect, and that Sienna had practiced enough times to now achieve with some reliability. The Hyde Park building had been written about in 3 publications, 2 architecture journals and 1 general interest magazine that called it a model of ethical restoration practice, which was the phrase Sienna had put in her own notes at the beginning of the project and had never shared with anyone. The Ashworth partnership was 8 months old and had already generated 3 commissions of the scale Sienna had been working toward for a decade. The federal inquiry into the Delorenzo restructuring was ongoing, as expected, and would be ongoing for the foreseeable future. Damon appeared before a review panel in February and presented documentation that his attorney described afterward as the cleanest voluntary disclosure in the history of the panel's operation. The panel representative said nothing publicly. Privately, the attorney told Damen that the tone of the proceedings had shifted considerably from the adversarial posture of the opening months. Luca was, by all accounts, doing well. The colleague with patience had become something more, as he'd hoped. He and Sienna met for coffee occasionally, less frequently as the months passed and the new shapes of their lives filled in, but with genuine warmth when they did. Elena Delorenzo came to dinner at Sienna's apartment in April. She arrived with food she had made herself. 3 dishes, because she had decided one was insufficient, and she held Maya's face in both hands, the way she had held Sienna's face the night of the estate party, and she said, "You must be the one with opinions about spelling." Maya said, "I have opinions about a lot of things." Elena said, "Good, never stop." It was the best dinner Sienna had hosted in the Lincoln Park apartment. She thought about that afterward, about what it meant, that a table could hold this particular collection of people, that her daughter could sit across from this woman and talk about stuffed animal taxonomy, that an evening could be this ordinary and this specific at the same time. Damon was there. He sat at the table and ate Elena's food and listened to Maya explain her classification system with the same quality of complete attention he brought to everything, and at one point Maya said, "You're a good listener," with the diagnostic certainty she applied to all assessments of character. He said, "I had to learn to be." Maya considered this. "My mom says the important things you have to learn, not the things you already know." He looked at Sienna across the table. She looked back at him. "Your mom is right," he said. After dinner, after Elena had gone and Maya had been settled into her yellow room with the uneven braid undone and the stuffed rabbit and the settled certainty of a child who is safe, Sienna and Damon sat at the kitchen table with the remains of the meal and the quiet of the apartment around them. He had his hands flat on the table, a posture she'd come to read as his resting state. Not performing composure, just present. She had her coffee. The city was doing its late evening thing outside the windows, traffic thinning, the particular quality of urban night settling in. "She's something," he said about Maya. He said it the way people say things they mean too specifically for elaboration. "She is," Sienna agreed. "She told me at dinner that she's conducting an experiment to determine whether her rabbit prefers classical music or what she described as regular music. She's been running that experiment for 3 weeks. She presents weekly findings." He was quiet for a moment. She watched him. This man who had spent a long time in darkness building his way toward something, who had taken 3.5 years to dismantle what he'd inherited and was still paying the cost of it, who had looked at imperfect windows and said, "Makes the room feel like it has history," because he understood that history was not the same as damage. "What are you thinking?" she asked. He looked at her. "That this is the thing," he said simply. "This, right now. This is the thing I was building toward. Not the transition completion, not the legal resolution, not any external condition or achievement or outcome. This kitchen, this table, the sound of a 7-year-old sleeping in the next room." Sienna looked at the man across from her and felt the accumulated weight of the past year. All of it, the fear and the cost, and the work, and the difficult nights, and the moments where the right thing and the easy thing had been so far apart she'd had to choose deliberately, and felt it not as a burden, but as substance, the substance of something real. "It's a good thing," she said. "Yes," he said, "it is." She reached across the table and put her hand on his. He turned his palm up and held it, the way he'd held it in the Hyde Park building after their first real conversation, with the steadiness of a man who had learned that steadiness was not the same as stillness, that you could hold something securely without holding it still. Outside, Chicago continued in its indifferent, magnificent way. Winter becoming spring, becoming something else. The city that had been her starting over place, that she had come to alone with $8,000 and a portfolio and a daughter in her arms, still doing what cities do, moving, changing, holding the lives of its people without much regard for whether those lives were going well. But inside this kitchen, at this table, with this man's hand in hers, and her daughter's breathing audible through the wall of the yellow room. Inside here, something was entirely still. Not the stillness of absence, the stillness of completion. A mistake made in 2 seconds in a dark hallway in October had led, through 4 months of honesty that cost them both more than they'd anticipated, through 30 days of the hardest work she'd ever done, through a year of building something carefully and correctly, to this. To the knowledge that sometimes you find the right thing in the wrong moment, and the only question is whether you're brave enough to follow it back to where it leads. She had been brave enough. He had earned it. Maya had strong opinions about spelling, and in the yellow room, against her pillow, with her rabbit beside her, and the small frown she wore in sleep that was exactly her mother's expression when she was thinking, Maya Vale slept in the particular peace of a child who knows the people outside her door are exactly where they're supposed to be. Which they were. For the first time in a long time, they exactly were.